Hello and good morning, everybody, to another Hangouts and Headlines today on a cold and snowy Tuesday, January 14th here in Michigan, at least. I bet it's not cold and snowy everywhere that one might be listening to this particular episode in. But please do let me know. As you know, in Hangouts and Headlines, we're going to talk amongst ourselves for a little bit while we wait for everybody to come in to kind of get used to it, to talk with our community before we dive into the headlines today. And more on the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldini PR fight, as well as a legal one. So if you are in the comments, let me know. Let me know where you are writing in from. If you are in Southern California, let me know you're okay. Mrs. Hoeg Law has a number of family members that are in that Southern California area dealing with the wildfires. I'm happy to say that I think most everybody in her family is all right. But obviously, we understand that that is not the case for everyone. So if you are able to be in chat today and you have something to let us know about, please do. And then we will proceed, as we do here, talking about the media, talking about lawsuits, talking about law and politics and pop culture, as it turns out in this particular story. So let's first check in with Pants, who's in New Hampshire. Happy to see you, Pants. Happy to see you, Pants' profile dog. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited about having this conversation with everybody here today. Mysterica Claus says, "Oh, I caught you live. Morning, Hoeg. I overslept, so I just woke up, about to make coffee. I don't like how she presented the movie, but what he agreed to stop doing was disgusting. Both are terrible." And yes, I think, as I said at the end of last part one of this particular saga, as we're discussing here, I think that you can look at the claims that are made by Blake Lively in that complaint to the state of California and say, if it is as presented there, then these are bad things that need to be fixed. But there are holes in that story. There are places that are maybe not as strong as are portrayed in the New York Times article. And that's one of the reasons we have a lawsuit to discuss today. Joe Beer, being a member for 23 months. Thank you so much for being a member so long, Joe. Yay, finally caught you live. Been a while for me. I haven't been doing a ton of videos, so that's not your fault as much as mine. Read this whole thing. I'm reserving any judgment until we hopefully get to a trial. Smiley face emoji. Yeah, I have bad news for most people on that front. It's very unlikely for this to wind up in an actual court that we can comment on the evidence presented. Doesn't mean it can't happen, as we saw with Depp v. Heard. That was very unlikely to go to trial as well. This could wind up in trial somewhere, but it is unlikely based on what we've seen so far. Or as Against the Tide says, don't forget they are just claims so far. They are, in fact, just claims. Anybody can claim anything. That's part of the story with the New York Times article, is that so much of it seemed to have been based on the allegations in that complaint, as they admit in part, but not always, in that article, that it does seem like it perhaps was a little bit incurious about the nature of the allegations and reported them as fact in a way that certain people that were mentioned in that article would undoubtedly be uncomfortable with, and what is the precept for the lawsuit we're about to review. Tough Cookie, thank you for becoming a member today. I really appreciate it. And let me make sure that I grab every other starred message here before we proceed. I do want to thank my dad for gifting 5 Hoeg Law memberships on this channel. He's always a great support of the channel, he and my mom both. And I really appreciate that. This is obviously something that was unexpected as part of my career path going to law school. So I really do appreciate the support here on the YouTube channel, and everybody else that supports regularly with memberships or super chats or just comments. Everybody helps this channel thrive, and I really, really appreciate it. Thanks again, Dad. Carrie Harvey says, I would love for it to make it to discovery. I don't see how it's in Baldoni's interest to settle with the impact it's had on him so far. Yeah, and I think the lawsuit that we're going to discuss today is a part of not quote-unquote settling, not settling in the court of public opinion, at least, for purposes of this conversation. But realistically, for an issue like this, where discovery would have to dive deep into emails and conversations that you maybe weren't 100% sure what you said about any given person involved with these things. And clearly there are high egos, high drama behind the scenes of this movie and between these people. And you're probably not certain that every aspect of every communication you've ever made is entirely clean or can't be spun against you. Then discovery is going to be something that your lawyers are going to sit you down and say, are you sure you want to go through with this? And that's when settlements happen. So I still don't think this is likely to wind up in a real trial setting, but we'll have to wait and see on that front. Jane Stoddart says, this is a case of the PR teams. I keep wondering why I was seeing 6-year-old interviews with a pregnant Blake Lively in the summer. And that's a part of the story as well. We saw that as alleged in the New York Times article that Norwegian, I think it's Norwegian, influencer had posted videos of an interview that they had done with Blake Lively a while back. And one of the things I said is that the New York Times kind of implies that that's a part of a smear campaign against Blake Lively. It certainly could be. We don't know. Again, as part of this conversation, we're not sitting in the room. We don't know any of the specifics on these facts. So we have to analyze what we're seeing from the allegations and, yes, use our judgment for what we think is more likely to have occurred, but understanding at each step that we can't know specifics without primary source material, without evidence, without discovery. These are both allegations made by PR teams against each other. This is a PR war. And I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of this is we rarely see heavily resourced people engage in a PR fight of this size through these major outlets like the New York Times. And so this is a fight of PR teams, but I would also caution for folks to just say, well, those old interviews surfaced because of PR teams. They certainly could have, but the way that social media works, the way that the new media works, if you want to call it that, in 2025 is that you see something trending, you look in your archives and you say, hey, I have something on topic for that. And then I float that video up of my own accord because I can get clicks, because I can potentially get revenue on X or on YouTube or wherever. And yes, that can look like a PR campaign, but it's essentially a snowballing social effect, a kind of network effect of bad news for somebody. So yes, it only takes a spark to ignite a fire. And you can be against that. You can think this is entirely a smear campaign by Justin Baldoni and his team that was successful beyond their wildest dreams, except for resulting in a New York Times article against it. Or you can think that this is just kind of natural gravitation towards things that I had in my archive that I could float for this purpose. And certainly that particular influencer we saw in the New York Times article itself denied having anything to do with the PR teams. Dad says, I like this topic a lot. Logged in from 35,000 feet. Yes, they are flying. They're being snowbirds today. But I really appreciate the super chat, Dad. And I really appreciate you spending the money on Wi-Fi to hear from your son, who you just saw watch the Vikings get obliterated on Monday Night Football last night. Sorry about that, Vikings fans. And so I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I know you guys like this topic. I know you guys like this discussion. I think it's an important one to have because I think we spend a lot of time talking about how the media reports on things. We don't talk as much about how effective private parties are in kind of manipulating that process. Right. And I think however you feel about Blake Lively, however you feel about Ryan Reynolds or Justin Baldoni, this is an active PR fight using these ostensibly objective outlets as the ammunition in their PR fight. And that's a part of this story. And it's one that I would tell everybody here in Hangouts and Headlines and elsewhere that we need to keep track of. We need to keep informed about when we look at stories, especially with celebrities that are well-resourced or companies that are well-resourced, because they do have the ability to put out press releases in a certain way, to have communications and back office conversations with journalists, not in a negative way, not in a way that we should just deride entirely, but to acknowledge that that does in fact happen because there is money on the line. Reputations for a celebrity matter just as much as dollars in the checking account matter, because reputations lead to those dollars in the checking account, and they have every reason to go and fight for them in this capacity or in any other. So when we talk about these things, I think it's important to understand that's the nature of the environment in which the New York Times finds itself. That is also, by the way, the nature of the environment in which YouTubers, TikTokers, or other influencers find themselves, right? So I don't take a lot. I don't think I take really any sponsorships here on this channel. I, of course, allow YouTube ads, and that's their own sponsorship, but I am not negotiating those contracts myself. But every single influencer, Twitch streamer, TikToker, X poster that's verified and collecting money from Elon Musk, whoever it may be, has incentives to go and get those clicks, but also to keep their access pathways open, to not offend people in an unjust way or deliberately in a manner that might reduce those numbers. And we always have to keep that in mind because I consider myself to be a very honest broker on these things. But honestly, even though you find yourself here listening to me, you don't know me personally, so you have to take that on a certain element of trust, which I very much appreciate here on this channel. But we do that with everybody that we listen to, whether it's at the New York Times or whether it's on TikTok. And so there are incentives that are floating around for everybody in all of these fields that we maybe don't think about as much as we should. Catherine Frazier says, for me, the New York Times article appeared fully fledged just after the claim and written by the reporter who initiated Me Too reporting. It was ready to go minutes later. I don't think it was actually ready to go minutes later. We'll see this claimed in the lawsuit we're about to read. But the claim that Justin Baldoni and his team are going to make is that the only way an article like that, which is a long one, gets written based on that complaint is if Team Lively was working with the New York Times behind the scenes well before that complaint got filed. And I think that does ring true to me. Again, that's not illegal. It isn't negative on its face. But I do think that the New York Times and that particular author, which, as you said, has proudly proclaimed that she helped foment the Me Too movement, was a sympathetic voice, sympathetic face at the New York Times and used for this purpose to place a PR article, which is why it is a little bit ironic that the New York Times article has a paragraph towards the end that says Lively's team basically is not putting anything against Baldoni in PR terms, when that New York Times article is in fact that action by Team Lively. But reasonable minds can differ on even that. And so we will continue from there. Mrs. Hoeg says, thank you for being here, everyone. Doing some things today, but I wanted to pop in. Thanks for being here against the Tide. Tide is always fantastic, always moderating, always helping out the channel. Thank you so much, Tide. Thank you, Mrs. Hoeg, for being here, even to pop in. I know you've got things on your plate. And so I really appreciate the note. Before we get started on the substance here, let us make sure we don't miss any other potential comments. B says, I agree. And there are so many reaction, commentary, gossip creators nowadays on socials. One small thing can blow up really quick, even without professional PR teams behind that. Yeah, I think it's a new world order for even the PR teams to kind of get used to this environment, right? And it was even newer a couple decades ago, but PR teams and crisis communicators and press release offices at giant corporations are only kind of now getting the smallest bit of a handle on how fast these things can spin up based on what people who are otherwise content creating want to do out there. Obviously, we're putting a spotlight on this article and these lawsuits without any connection to Team Baldoni or Team Lively. And yet some people are going to take my comments on this lawsuit and these articles one way or the other on these topics, right? Even going through part one, I received a number of comments on my criticism of the complaint in the New York Times reporting that said I was too sympathetic to Team Baldoni. I was too sympathetic to the claims that he was about to make in the lawsuit we're going to read today, even though I hadn't read through the lawsuit before that video was made. And one thing I wanted to say in response to that is if you haven't been with me in Virtual Legality or you haven't been with me in Hangouts and Headlines a lot before, one thing that tends to happen is that because I'm a very close reader, because I'm a very critical reader of things that are in front of me, it tends to come across a little bit like I'm against whatever the thesis statement of the article or lawsuit or complaint document is. And I think you'll probably see that a little bit more as we go through the Baldoni document. I just tend to nitpick and point out little things that we should think about as we look through a document. And some people read that as being against the document itself. I think realistically, it's just that the lawyer in me looks at a document, especially one that's just a complaint, just allegations from one side or the other, and says, let's try to think about this as neutrally as possible. How could this be spinning on us right now? Because that's the purpose of that document. And so I don't think I was overly sympathetic to Justin Baldoni's claims or the position that he was going to take, as we'll see in this video, in that criticism. But I do understand how people can get that. And I think it's important to close read and to observe and critique not just the things that we look at here, but also me and my commentary itself. So I appreciate that. But I did want to make that note before we got into the substance today. Katerina Gadecki is heading to spoiler territory here for today's video. I'd like to see actual evidence, but with the California anti-SLAPP laws on one side, federal court on the other, and my faith in some media still shaken by Depp v. Heard, I don't think much of that will be public. Yes, there's a lot of law that's going to come into play as to whether or not these things make it to trial as well. And we'll get into the legal aspects as part of this conversation, I promise. But yes, the California anti-SLAPP laws are going to be very important in understanding what is and isn't going to happen as part of the Baldoni lawsuit. And I think that's also informative of what Team Baldoni is doing with this lawsuit and what they are not doing. So with that as a somewhat cryptic entry point, let's dive into looking at this particular lawsuit. But before we do, of course, this channel is supported by listeners and viewers like you, whether live now in chat or in replay later on, through places like Playor and Patreon, both outside funding sources, memberships here, as we've already seen, donating memberships, becoming a member yourself, super chats, and everything else, telling your friends that we're having these conversations, upvoting, downvoting, leaving comments. I try to respond to as many comments of substance as I can throughout the week after I make a live video like this. So please do leave comments or chat comments if you'd like. I will probably take a break in the middle of this long form document to address comments and questions that I see because, as I noted in last week's episode, part 1, I did run out of voice halfway through, and I want to make sure that I keep it up to go through everything I wanted to discuss today. Thank you so much to everyone for all that support. And let's start where we left off last week. So in December of 2024, last year, the New York Times made this article, "We Can Bury Anyone Inside a Hollywood Smear Machine." And while the subheadline has private messages detail an alleged campaign to tarnish Blake Lively, the actual article itself was written maybe not so carefully in terms of allegations and what's actually happening here. So the New York Times said as part of this article, her filing, meaning Blake Lively's complaint to the California Civil Rights Department, includes excerpts from thousands of pages of text messages and emails that she obtained through a subpoena. Now, that subpoena is an open question mark. We may see that answered a little bit later on in this series. There's more lawsuits to go through, if you can believe it. These and other documents were reviewed by the New York Times. And I said even last week that this sentence stands out as somewhat odd because it seems to be claiming that the New York Times read through the text messages and emails rather than the excerpts of the text messages and emails. But nothing in this article as written seems to separate from what Blake Lively and her team were alleging in the complaint document itself. There weren't any additive comments, any additive text messages to what was in the complaint document. And so that struck me as a little odd, even when I read it for the first time, because it sure appeared that the New York Times was reporting as truth what was alleged in a legal complaint that is obviously just the claims of one side without any counterbalancing claims of the other. The New York Times continued with their article, despite quoting the Team Baldoni representative as saying it was all hokum, if you will, that the effort to tarnish Ms. Lively appears to have paid off, right? You don't see the word alleged there. You don't see that the effort to tarnish Ms. Lively is at all suspect or questioned, despite quoting the questioning in the paragraphs before. And so the New York Times could probably rightly be thought of as asserting the truth value of this assertion that there is a smear campaign happening by the time you get this far in the article. And indeed, that's what we will see Justin Baldoni and his representatives claim in a lawsuit filed in the state of California, or as the New York Times reporters responsible for that initial story report on, which I think is odd, itself. It ends with us, actor and director, and his publicists sue the Times for libel. And I don't know if they wrote that headline, but it's a little bit clunky, isn't it? You'd think actor/director might be better if you're going to use "and" twice. It's probably not ideal, but we're being a little bit critical there. Justin Baldoni claims that the Times defamed him and his team in an article about the actress Blake Lively's allegations that she had been the victim of a smear campaign. And this article is, again, written by Megan Twohey and Mike McIntyre, the same authors of the original article. Justin Baldoni, the director and co-star of the film It Ends With Us, and his publicist sued the New York Times on Tuesday, claiming the news organization defamed them in an article about allegations by Blake Lively, his co-star, that she had been the victim of a smear campaign. The lawsuit, which seeks $250 million in damages, accuses the Times of uncritically accepting a self-serving narrative by the actress that Mr. Baldoni, his production company, and their public relations team worked to harm her reputation after she complained about misconduct during the film's shooting. It asserts that the December 21st article deliberately omitted portions of text exchanges and other information that contradicted the actress's version of events. We're going to read this document, so we will skip most of the quotes here. But we do want to talk about what the Times had to say about this. Again, somewhat obtusely being reported on by the authors of the original article that is being claimed as libelous, that the New York Times made a statement to these authors that are employed by the New York Times that said, "We plan to vigorously defend against the lawsuit. The role of an independent news organization is to follow the facts where they lead. Our story was meticulously and responsibly reported. It was based on a review of thousands of pages of original documents, including the text messages and emails that we quote accurately and at length in the article. Now, again, this is a weird kind of hill to die on because it doesn't sound from the article that anything was added that might have appeared in the additional thousands of pages of documents. And yet they are claiming here that they had access to those when it is entirely unclear from the reporting that that is in fact the case. The complaint, which claimed sexual harassment and retaliation, included excerpts from thousands of pages of text messages and emails obtained through a subpoena, which were reviewed by the Times. And again, we're using pronouns kind of weirdly here, which were reviewed by the Times. What are we referring to with which, right? We've got this statement that says we reviewed thousands of pages of original documents, but are you referring to the complaint that was reviewed? Are you referring to those thousands of pages which were reviewed? It's not obvious to me. And again, I'm just reading this article for trying to understand what is happening behind the scenes. She alleged that as the release of the film approached in August 2024, fearful that her allegations would become public and taint them, Mr. Baldoni and Mr. Heath hired Ms. Nathan, a crisis public relations expert, and then Mr. Wallace to smear Ms. Lively's reputation instead. Now, you notice the difference in this paragraph from the one on December 21st? She alleged that is at the top of the paragraph. It's informing everything else that we say here. She alleged that a smear campaign was used against her. And the New York Times, in their original article, says that the one time, right? In a side letter to Ms. Lively's contract, according to a legal complaint that she filed Friday, it claims that their PR effort had an explicit goal to harm Ms. Lively's reputation. But by the time we get to where we're actually talking about what's being claimed, the effort to tarnish Ms. Lively appears to have paid off, right? It exists. There's no question. There's no alleged here. And that might be where the lawyers screwed up, right? If you're ever wondering why you read an article and you see alleged so often, is that if you're going to base your news reporting on the existence of allegations, you have to make clear throughout what you are reporting that what you are saying is not known to be true at this point in time, but the existence of the allegations is known to be true. And you report on the existence of those allegations, not the truth of the substance in those allegations. And they failed here in this paragraph. And it could potentially cost them. I don't think it will for legal reasons we'll talk about as we go on. But it is the reason why Team Baldoni was able to make a lawsuit like the one we see here, filed in the Superior Court of the state of California. Now, this is important, right? We saw in reference to a message earlier in our video that the state of California has very aggressive anti-SLAPP laws. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But suffice it to say, a case on these grounds made in the state of California is very unlikely to proceed past a very quick motion to strike, motion to dismiss the case. And so this is a particular decision made by Team Baldoni that I would offer seems strategically structured to not go to trial, right? We have a PR fight happening here, right? We have Team Lively having a complaint set to California that isn't itself a lawsuit, isn't itself public or obvious to news reporters that it even was filed, and it somehow gets made into headline news in the New York Times. And in response, Baldoni files a lawsuit in a jurisdiction that is very difficult to have this lawsuit actually even make it to a discovery or trial phase in an effort to get his message out there, right? And so we can be critical of both sides of this. They're using the legal system, the justice system, and potential complaints to fight a public relations war, to fight in the court of public opinion, in all likelihood without a real chance of making it into a court of law. So let's take a look at what he says here. Plaintiffs Wayfarer Studios, we know that that is the studio that produced the movie, Justin Baldoni, Jamie Heath, his CEO, Steve Sarowitz, the financier of Wayfarer, Melissa Nathan, their outside crisis PR person, the agency group, her company, Jennifer Abel, their inside PR person, RWA Communications, Jed Wallace, who we still don't know what did because the New York Times doesn't know, and Street Relations, Inc., by and through their counsel hereby bring the following causes of action against defendants, the New York Times Company, and Doe's 1 to 100, inclusive. Doe's 1 to 100 are anonymous, right? We don't know who they are for whatever reason. It might be their social media posters. It might be that we just want to reserve a space for other people that work at the New York Times to bring as a claim here. But the way that you file these cases is to say, we know that there are more people involved in this, but we don't know who they are before we go through discovery. So we reserve the right to add them as part of the process here. That's what Doe's mean, like John Doe. Introduction. At 9:46 p.m. on Friday, December 20th, 2024, importantly, the day before that article went live, New York Times reporter Megan Twohey requested plaintiff's response to an imminent 4,000-word bombshell story concerning their alleged orchestration of a smear campaign targeting Blake Lively, purportedly in response to Lively's disclosure of concerns about the working environment on the set of It Ends With Us. And we did see that article go live on December 21st. The film's production company, Wayfarer, its principals, Baldoni and Heath, and its public relations representatives, Nathan and Abel, were asked to provide on-the-record comment and to notify the Times of any inaccuracies by noon the next day on December 21st, 2024, a mere 14 hours overnight. So again, like we talked about with respect to the Lively complaint, the job of this document is to tell a story, especially if you don't think you're actually going to make it to trial on this because it's a very difficult road to go down in California. The job of this is to create a story so that folks like me, folks that might otherwise pick it up in the media, can tell that story to their readers or to their viewers or listeners. And so this is telling you a story about how little time they got to respond, right? They're trying to frame the New York Times as essentially acting in bad faith on this. They only gave us 14 hours to respond. Then we'll see later on that they published before the deadline was over anyway. Despite its claim to have reviewed these along with other documents, the Times relied almost entirely on Lively's unverified and self-serving narrative, lifting it nearly verbatim while disregarding an abundance of evidence that contradicted her claims and exposed her true motives. But the Times did not care. Given the breadth of the article and the coordinated drop, it is readily apparent that the Times had been quietly working in concert with Lively's team for weeks or months. The Times participated actively in the legal maneuvering at the heart of Lively's strategy. Notably, Lively chose not to file a lawsuit against Baldoni, Wayfarer, or any of the plaintiffs. That'll come up again later on, probably as part of this series. I don't know if I'm going to cover every lawsuit here. A choice that spared her from the scrutiny of the discovery process, including answering questions under oath and producing her communications. This decision was no accident. First, her administrative complaint is rife with blatant falsehoods and egregious misrepresentations that would have subjected her to dismissal, if not sanctions. Second, pursuing formal legal action would have derailed her true objective, an orchestrated campaign to rehabilitate her public image. So understand what the claim of Baldoni is here. This is a PR war. She's accusing us of orchestrating a smear campaign, but the person who's really orchestrating a smear campaign is Blake Lively. That is the claim that Justin Baldoni and his team is making here. And I do think that if you look at the complaint being discussed in the New York Times so quickly, that there was certainly a leak, and it seems to come from Team Lively for the purposes of getting an article written in the New York Times like the one that was written. This is framed in this complaint from Baldoni as egregious and underhanded and bad faith. I don't necessarily view it that way. It's fairly standard kind of PR tactics. I think the New York Times itself probably did owe some additional scrutiny to just looking at an allegation of complaints, but they didn't do that, and I'm not sure it was a legal obligation as much as an ethical and moral obligation, as we will talk about in just a minute. Instead, Lively filed a request for a right to sue letter with the California Civil Rights Department. Kind of, right? We're not entirely certain exactly what that complaint was seeking in this context. I framed it as believing that the complaint was issued to the state of California to encourage them to investigate these particular circumstances, like we saw in the Activision case discussed earlier on this channel. But it could have been the case that you go and you ask for a right to sue letter because you can't sue for employment discrimination in the state of California without essentially going through this process and the California Civil Rights Department saying, you can sue instead of us. We're not going to take it up for you. So it's a little bit of an extra hoop to jump through in California. It could have been for that purpose. We can assume that Team Baldoni has some information on this that would indicate that that's correct. Again, it's always wise to assume the lawyers aren't deliberately and directly lying in a legal document filed with the court. They have ethical and other obligations to maintain their bar status and active lawyer status to not lie directly. Doesn't mean they can't be obtuse. Doesn't mean you can't read between the lines in some of the things they say. But it's probably pretty safe to assume that this is what Lively was doing if it's asserted here. While such a letter can precede a lawsuit, it is clear that litigation was never her ultimate goal. And these references to her not wanting to pursue a lawsuit are important because Blake Lively will pursue a lawsuit in a different jurisdiction, in a different place, and we'll probably talk about that as part of this series. I don't know how many episodes in Hangouts and Headlines I want to spend discussing Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni. But if you guys continue to like it, you can leave me a comment in this episode or in the chat right now to let me know that you are enjoying these conversations. We could potentially cover the other two pending lawsuits that we have related to this topic right now. Lively found willing allies at the New York Times, which uncritically embraced her CRD complaint as fact and disregarded the plaintiff's emphatic objections. Without even waiting for the response deadline of noon on December 21st, 2024, and we'll see why that's important in a minute, the Times rushed to publish its inflammatory article, "We Can Bury Anyone," inside a Hollywood smear machine at 10:11 a.m., nearly 2 hours early. This brazen disregard for journalistic integrity and fairness resulted in an article rife with inaccuracies, misrepresentations, and omissions. We're going to get to the legal standards of those claims in just a minute, because I'm not sure that what is described in this document is actually the obligation that the New York Times or any other outlet has to its subjects, especially subjects in the public eye. And that's going to be a part of this story as well. In an era where public trust in media has reached a historic low and legacy outlets are increasingly criticized as biased and agenda-driven, the Times has chosen to double down on sensationalism and oversimplified narratives. Rather than striving for accuracy and balance, it has prioritized hollow signaling over substantive reporting, further eroding its credibility and exacerbating the very mistrust it claims to combat. And again, this paragraph isn't really doing anything except kind of bloviating. Lawyers do this, right? They're telling a story. The article's central thesis, encapsulated in a defamatory headline designed to immediately mislead the reader, is the plaintiffs orchestrated a retaliatory public relations campaign against Lively for speaking out about sexual harassment, a premise that is categorically false and easily disproven. If the Times truly reviewed the thousands of private communications it claimed to have obtained, its reporters would have seen incontrovertible evidence that it was Lively, not plaintiffs, who engaged in a calculated smear campaign. The complete communications demonstrate beyond question that plaintiffs had no intention of destroying or burying Lively through aggressive tactics. On the contrary, Baldoni consistently expressed his desire to avoid harming Lively and protect the film, but also recognized a legitimate need for public relations protection in light of Lively's false and damaging claims. And here we're going to get into the first of our photos of what appear to be signal messages based on the interface here. But I do want you to take a moment to recognize how difficult it is to actually go through all of these documents and make pictures of them and put them in a lawsuit like this one, make sure they fit, make sure it's obvious what it is we're pointing to, all these red circles and red underlines, just to understand that the associates on these teams, the people that are just coming out of law school and trying to learn their craft, are busy doing work on these things, right? You've got the lawyers that are bloviating. There's probably a partner or someone else writing the politics type stuff, but you've got real on-the-ground work being done by baby lawyers, young lawyers just out of law school, figuring out how to grab all these things, going through all these text messages, deciding what is most useful for the case, and then going through the process of making them readable for folks like us. So here we see a message from Melissa Nathan, that is their outside PR guy or PR lady, apologies, that says, "Good morning, sharing with you a perfect example of why we don't use bots. I wouldn't even worry to think they've hired a team, as A, there's nothing to find, and B, they hired an awful team, which I've sent to our guy to track and poll, so we have evidence of it. This below should answer everyone's question on what a bot team looks like when every single comment suddenly skews in her favor in a nonsensical way." And then she links an Instagram item. "At least sprinkle them in. She needs to fire her bot team." So this is a text from Melissa Nathan to Team Baldoni saying, Justin Baldoni was worried that we might use bots on our side. We saw that reference in the New York Times article and the complaint itself as a message related to how the smear campaign from the Baldoni side would go. Justin says, "How can we say somehow that we are not doing any of this? It looks like we are trying to take her down." And then Nathan responds, "It doesn't. They are doing all of this themselves, and it's really obvious. This is bots." And then she, again, connects a picture. Justin says, "Okay, please monitor. Things I'm more worried about is that we are planting these stories, which is not true, obviously." And one thing that's difficult with text messages, and it's difficult in this lawsuit and any other lawsuit where you see text messages quoted, is that people are not always super careful about grammar or sentence structure or how they're communicating on text messages. The idea is just to get a concept across as quickly as possible in the text message context. And so you have weird idiosyncrasies with like, "Okay, please," no punctuation, "monitor." "Okay, please monitor" is probably the message there. And then "things I'm more worried about is that we are planning these stories, which is not true, obviously." Jen Abel, internal at Wayfarer, says, "Chiming in here, the people saying that there are bots and that this is a PR play on your side is a minority compared to thousands and thousands who are calling it what it is and reacting to Blake's own actions and interviews." So this is included in this lawsuit because this is the Baldoni team talking amongst themselves about the fact that what they think they are seeing is that Blake Lively is essentially burning her own house down. It's their own actions and interviews that are popping up. We don't have a bot network. It's just her own negative PR of being herself that is out there making things negative. And again, there's an open question as part of this entire story as to whether Baldoni and Wayfarer would want to burn their star in their movie down to the ground in any event, right? So this all has to be premised on Baldoni and Heath and Wayfarer wanting to protect themselves from sexual harassment complaints, because the actual notion here that he would want to just eviscerate his lead actress doesn't make sense without that additional context. Tag team, I believe, is reference to the Nathan side of things. Her company is called Tag, again, or is at least shortened to Tag. It ends with us. Sony chief praises Blake Lively for advancing the conversation around domestic violence. They messaged me 5 minutes before this went up. Tag team has that link. Jamie Heath, the CEO of Wayfair, says, so glad Blake was praised. Let her get a win. It would be nice to have a Sony executive praise Justin. And yes, these messages seem to go towards the fact that the internal Wayfarer side was okay with Blake getting positive coverage. And there's no reason that the New York Times would have to include this in their article necessarily, although it does kind of speak against a coordinated smear campaign against the actress. So you would hope that the New York Times, if they did get access to all of these materials, would have gone through them. But we have to take on faith that they had access to these materials as it stands. We know that Team Baldoni does, presumably because this is his Signal account, but we don't know what the New York Times had because it's unclear what they're even claiming to have had. The article is predicated on Lively's CRD complaint, that's the California Civil Rights Department again, which references text exchanges between Nathan and Abel as purported evidence that Nathan planted a negative story in the Daily Mail, titled, Is Blake Lively Set to be Canceled? And we looked at this in part 1. Lively's portrayal is categorically false, misleading, and devoid of factual basis, yet knowingly endorsed by the Times, which claims to have reviewed thousands of pages of text messages and emails. Kind of. They kind of claim that. The smear campaign hinges on an August 16th text exchange in which Nathan allegedly shared a link to this article with Abel. The text exchange shows Abel responding, wow, followed by, you really outdid yourself with this one, to which Nathan allegedly replied, that's why you hired me, right? I'm the best. These messages constitute the entirety of the purported evidence underlying the allegation of a smear campaign orchestrated on behalf of Baldoni. I don't know that that's fully accurate. I don't think these messages alone constitute the entirety of the purported evidence, but they do constitute a bulk of what the New York Times reported. So you see here the pictures again of what appears to be an iMessage interface here. Included, here's the article in the Daily Mail. Wow, you really outdid yourself with this piece, says Jen Abel with this little emoji of an upside down smiley face. That's why you hired me, right? I'm the best, says Melissa Nathan. Heading to the airport, and there's a drive through the jungle that there's going to be no reception for around 24 hours. Joke, 45 minutes. Jen Abel then says, I'm sorry. You being offline for 45 minutes was not included in the scope. Unacceptable. And then some picture after that with a ha-ha response that we can already see. And you can see even from this text, Jen Abel, their internal PR person, is a little bit snarky, is a little bit cheeky in this message exchange. This is what you might consider rapport in any other context of colleagues essentially, giving a little crap to each other in the context of what are otherwise stressful professional duties. And I mentioned this when we looked at the quotes in the New York Times article in part 1, but there is this context that does come in that says, if you have all of this context and you're the New York Times, maybe you don't report it exactly the same way that you wound up reporting it. Is that libelous? We've got all sorts of issues there. But is the New York Times maybe not reporting everything that was actually in these text messages as we would expect if we wanted a fulsome and complete understanding of what these interactions actually were? Yes, I think that is clear. The Times, however, was aware that these text messages were unscrupulously altered and selectively edited, enabling both Lively and her team in the Times to propagate a false smear campaign narrative designed to destroy plaintiffs. I'm not sure how Team Baldoni would know that the Times was aware that the text messages were altered. I just don't know that, but it is an allegation made here in this lawsuit. Specifically, in the immediately preceding text exchange on August 16th, Nathan forwarded a screenshot of a message from a reporter informing her for the first time of the Daily Mail article. In response, Nathan wrote, damn, this is not fair because it's also not me, followed by everything now looks like it's me, conclusively refuting her involvement in the creation or dissemination of the article. So the claim being made here by the Baldoni in that first sentence, which I didn't immediately understand, is that if you have access to all these texts, then you see that Melissa Nathan has already said that that's not my article and that Jen Abel is essentially, again, being sarcastic, being snarky, being collegial with a colleague in this very stressful circumstance. And we don't know if the New York Times actually had access to this. We know that they kind of claimed that they did, and that's an important part of this story. Further evidence of the Times' complicity arises from its apparent endorsement of the criminal alteration of these text messages by Lively. After Nathan forwarded a screenshot of the article link, Abel responded with, "You really outdid yourself with this piece," with that upside down smiley emoji we just talked about, to indicate the sarcastic nature of her message. The upside down smiley emoji is commonly used to convey irony, sarcasm, joking, or a sense of goofiness or silliness. For the record, this is one of the reasons why, if you're talking to your lawyer about any kind of communications, we do recommend phone calls over emails or text exchanges on really important matters like crisis PR, because it may not be the case that eliminating the emoji is actually libelous, that reporting like the New York Times did is actually defamatory, because you did write these words in a text message, and it's not the obligation of the reporter to necessarily understand your sarcasm, your report, or your collegiality. And that can feel unfair. And I just talked about the fact that I think that that's probably correct, that it is unfair, that the Baldoni reports here on these pictures do seem to be more persuasive than what the New York Times reported in their article and what was in the complaint by Blake Lively. But this is why you got to be careful with what you put down in writing, because sarcasm can just essentially be skipped in a legal document or in a New York Times article if you find yourself unlucky to be the subject of one. And so that's what's being alleged here. All the things we just talked about is that the New York Times essentially knew that this was false and reported it as false anyway, which is important for defamation, right? This is a libel suit against the New York Times. And in the case of a public figure, basically you have to allege that the other side knew it was false when they did what they did. In her CRD complaint, Lively deliberately excluded not only the preceding screenshot of the text exchange disproving Nathan's involvement in the story, but also that emoji, which fundamentally alters the sarcastic tone of Abel's message and misleads the reader into interpreting her response as serious. This omitted context is critical, etc. I think we can understand the argument for why it would be bad to take a sarcastic message and treat it as completely upfront. Any negative press about Lively was unequivocally a consequence of her own actions. Even the Times itself acknowledged Lively's public missteps in an article on August 17th, 2024, entitled, "It Ends With Us, The Press Tour Drama Explained." New York Times, not above celebrity gossip, everybody. In it, reporter Shivani Gonzalez observed, Lively's promotion of the movie has included a push for her new hair care line, discussion of the clothes in the movie, and response to questions about abuse, which has been criticized as shallow and tone deaf. Baldoni, by contrast, has emphasized the importance of raising awareness of domestic violence and providing resources for those in similar situations. Now, this would be an effective paragraph as an argument why the New York Times is being disingenuous in the article that it posts on December 21st, except that the substance of that article is that there was a smear campaign against her. So essentially, the New York Times defense to this is that we were the unwitting victims of a smear campaign, right? That we wound up reporting on this tone deafness, just like the Daily Mail did, because Nathan and Abel and Wayfarer and Baldoni and Heath were out there planting stories in a way that was unfair to Blake Lively, and we were unfortunately not good enough journalists to detect that when we made that article in August of 2024. Now, the New York Times doesn't want to go with that defense quite that strongly, but that is what the New York Times would claim in response to that kind of avenue of attack. All right, then we've got some more messages here with some salty language. Lively's marketing efforts, which included encouraging audiences to grab your friends and wear your florals while promoting her hair care and alcohol brands, were widely criticized as insensitive. This was particularly glaring given World Health Organization statistics showing that 55% of domestic violence incidents involve alcohol. Her actions naturally triggered organic public criticism and unleashed a cycle of negative coverage, including, as is common in the digital age, the resurfacing of old, unflattering content. And this is the argument from a logic perspective that we were talking about in part one and earlier in this video, which is to say, this is exactly what happens when you've got one of these kind of outspoken actors or actresses out there that have years and years and years of material and something goes negative or wrong for them, right? We saw this with respect to Captain Marvel, whose name escapes me, in the MCU. We're seeing it with Blake Lively here. I would argue that in some respects, we see it with Ryan Reynolds, even as part of this story, and we'll get to that at the end of this video. But again, as I said in part one, I am somewhat tilted against Ryan Reynolds and his public image, and so I do want to make that clear. As part of my conversation content here, you can discount what I say and evaluate my tilt on that subject as you see fit. I do not get good vibes, if you will, from Ryan Reynolds. I never have. And so that does inform my understanding of what he's doing out there at the time. And I can admit to that as part of this analysis, certainly. Tag says, this is a movie about domestic violence that they wore florals to. Zoe sent me this on Saturday and goes, this is a crazy way to market this movie. And yes, I do think that Nathan and Tag and the PR leaned into this, maybe helped Blake Lively get hoisted on her own petard, if you will. But I'm not sure that they made this up. I'm not sure that that's a smear campaign to highlight areas in which things are going poorly for her. Is that something that relates to sexual harassment? Is that something that is a deliberate smear in order to protect their clients from illegal activities? I don't know that that is the case. Far from being the product of a calculated smear campaign by plaintiffs, the backlash against Lively was the inevitable fallout of her own tone-deaf messaging and self-promotional tactics, amplified by her inability to read the room in addressing such a serious subject. Melissa Nathan says, none of us would ever do this, when Justin Baldoni asks if this is us in respect to a specific article. No one even pays attention to this person past 2005. He is not relevant. He does not create a news headline. He does not get pickup. He is just now a troll. It's organic. She's blown herself up by her own actions. And these are messages happening contemporaneous to this circumstance, which does go to understand that this isn't a smear campaign, at least in the words of these people that would be ostensibly responsible for conducting the smear campaign. This just ran another article. Obviously, none of us knew about this either, but once media goes in, they go in. She handed this to him on a silver platter. On a plate is actually what she says here. Just concentrate on the success of the movie, your family, and your next project. I have this weird feeling that she's going to reach out to you for a conversation in the next couple of weeks, or he will. I don't know who he is there. Maybe Ryan Reynolds in particular, for respective unearthed Blake Lively interview shows her used slur for trans people. And yes, there is a feeding frenzy. We saw this. And I do think that can feel unfair to the people in the middle of that feeding frenzy. I saw that with respect to Amber Heard during the Depp trial. And I thought a number of the things that happened with respect to the separate coverage of Amber Heard was unfair. And I do apologize for anybody that thinks that and thinks that I am not being critical enough of what we saw in that particular trial. But I do think even with circumstances where someone is acting in a very bad way, and I do think that Amber Heard looked to be lying in that trial, in the testimony that she gave in Depp v. Heard, that means that we just have carte blanche to eviscerate her in every kind of context and format on social media. So I do understand and I'm sympathetic to that kind of notion that you're just having at the center of a feeding frenzy, but that doesn't mean it's orchestrated by someone else. God, I'm so over this, says Tag Team again. I'm sure Leslie thinks we placed this one as well. Yep, and same. So even internally, they thought that they were getting credit for a smear campaign that they were not orchestrating. And we don't know why that might be, but we do know that these text messages exist that suggest that isn't what's happening behind the scenes. And again, this is important because the heart of a defamation case, as you know, if you did follow Depp v. Heard, is the lie, right? Defamation is lying about someone and harming them through that lie. And so there has to be a lie here. And the main thesis statement coming from the New York Times is that Baldoni and Wayfarer orchestrated a smear campaign, right? That headline is inside a Hollywood smear machine. So all of this is asserting that Baldoni, Wayfarer, and Heath and Nathan are orchestrating a smear campaign against one of the more popular actresses in Hollywood. And so the response in the lawsuit is all that's a lie. And if the New York Times had access to what they say they had access to, they would have known it was a lie at the time, which is important because Baldoni and movie makers in general are public figures, especially when you bring in the domestic violence aspect of things, because that is a question of public interest. Domestic violence happening, sexual harassment happening, all of those are things that are in the public zeitgeist and are of interest to the public. You could argue that anything that winds up getting reported in the New York Times is of public interest, but that wouldn't fly because the New York Times can't otherwise be hamstrung in its First Amendment rights by popularity. And so in this particular case, you've got figures of public interest. You've got an accusation made against Justin Baldoni, who maybe isn't as famous as Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, but is a figure of public interest for this purpose because he made a movie about domestic violence and because he is someone that has otherwise entered into this discussion on domestic violence, as we saw with the way that he chose to publicize his movie himself. We have more pictures here. You can see that Leslie bashes Melissa, tries to get me to say that Melissa was planting stories and bad-mouthing Blake. Never once did she mention anything about sexual harassment. She told me that she did not like Melissa on multiple occasions, et cetera, et cetera. So infighting, right? This is normal for professionals, unfortunately, but it is the case. We'll skip through some of this. People's story about JB is false, about cast and crew hating him. So there's a little bit of an internal fight that we'll see about whether the cast and crew hate Justin Baldoni. Again, we saw that asserted by Blake Lively. We saw various things in part one and in the allegations in the California complaint about Blake Lively and the other cast and crew members of the movie deliberately making appearances without Justin Baldoni. And there are disputes internally at the time about whether everyone hates Justin or not. Do you have sources? Blake Lively camp keeps thinking it's us placing and we are doing F-all. Melissa Nathan actually saying we're not setting any of this up. And Blake Lively's PR representative is accusing the company of doing this at the time. Obviously, things don't just automatically explode into California complaints and New York Times articles and lawsuits for libel and lawsuits for sexual harassment. So part of this was simmering as part of production, and accusations were being made against Melissa Nathan even before all this went down. She hasn't done anything literally anti-Blake, says James. Leslie says, okay. She told me the same thing that she told you, which is she said that Blake's backlash is organic. Leslie says it's not. She did nothing, et cetera, et cetera. So they're fighting about whether Blake Lively is responsible for any of this. And then we've got a statement for TMZ email exchange. Jennifer Abel saying, Jamie and team, FYI, I'm a reporter at TMZ and I'm reaching out to get information. We are being told that there were at least 3 HR complaints filed against Justin Baldoni. It's unclear where TMZ would get that information. But again, that strikes as a leak from Team Lively as part of this context. And we've got more messages here. This is not the way I would prefer to do a lawsuit type document here. This is too much without context for the court. Again, you're trying to make it easy on the court to understand what it is that you're alleging. And one of the things that they've done here in a couple of these instances is that they've summarized what they just showed you in the paragraph afterwards. I don't love this technique for writing this document, but I do think they're trying to kill you with a deluge here. They're trying to show all these ways in which the Lively complaint is not at least 100% accurate. And I think that's effective in certain respects, but it's not easy to read in this context that we're doing here, or it wouldn't be easy for the judge or court to read in the context that they might look at a document like this. To assert that plaintiffs orchestrated a premeditated smear campaign is to disregard objective evidence that unequivocally contradicts such claims if they had access to it. Even a cursory investigation by the Times would have exposed the baseless nature of Lively's allegations and the lack of factual support for her narrative. Most troubling, however, is the Times' deliberate omission of a critical player in this manufactured controversy. Stephanie Jones. That's a name we haven't heard before. We'll likely hear about it again. Once Baldoni and Wayfarer's trusted public relations representative, Jones not only had intimate access to the communication strategy and crisis management surrounding the film, but also played a pivotal role in leaking private communications cited in the article. Her betrayal, driven by a quid pro quo arrangement with Lively, appears aimed at shielding herself while aligning with Lively to curry favor and secure future opportunities. So the allegation here is that they essentially had a defector. They had someone internal at Wayfarer, a public relations representative, not Jen Abel, but Stephanie Jones, who took that access, stole it, leaked it to Lively, potentially leaked it to the New York Times, and created all this problem for everybody as part of this story. The Times compounded its journalistic failures by uncritically advancing Lively's unsubstantiated claims of sexual harassment against Heath and Baldoni. That was not the focus of their article, but they undoubtedly did advance that as part of the narrative. For example, the article, based on Lively's CRD complaint, sensationally alleges that Mr. Heath had shown Lively a video of his naked wife, with Lively's CRD complaint even labeling the footage as pornography. This claim is patently absurd. The video in question was a non-pornographic recording of Heath's wife and baby during a home birth, a deeply personal one with no sexual overtone. To distort this benign event into an act of sexual misconduct is outrageous and emblematic of the lengths to which Lively and her collaborators are willing to go to defame plaintiff. And I do think that a lot of the complaints that we saw in the Lively document required us to kind of take them on their face, required us to say, okay, she said it was pornographic. It was pornographic. He did this while he was next to her whispering in a dancing scene as part of filming of the article. There aren't a lot of ways to corroborate that. But again, I'm sympathetic to the notion that in a he said, she said like this one, there are often instances where you're going to have allegations that are very difficult to be corroborated. Unfortunately for Ms. Lively, in this particular instance, this was a video that they were able to find and show to the court for this purpose. And I will leave it to you all in the chat or in the comments or later on listening to this video to ascertain for yourselves whether you find that video to be pornographic. I think most will say that it is not, and that it is in fact a dramatic reading of what that video actually shows, which is to say that if Lively is willing to hyperbolize and dramatize at least some of what she complains about in that allegation, then we have to take an even closer look at the rest of what she says, right? If you are willing to hyperbolize in one instance, we have to be concerned about you're willing to hyperbolize in other instances. And that, I think, is what's happening in that document. And I think this is a good, effective piece to this lawsuit from Team Baldoni. The Times' failure to scrutinize these claims or even provide a balanced account of the events further underscores its role in amplifying Lively's falsehoods while abandoning its responsibility to truth and accuracy. Not really a legal responsibility, by the way. The video was shown to Lively as part of a creative discussion in preparation for a birthing scene in the film. Heath informed Lively that his wife condoned his displaying the video. Any suggestion that Heath engaged in the exhibition of pornography or inappropriate content is false. Adding to the sexual harassment narrative is the article's parroted accusation that both men repeatedly entered her makeup trailer uninvited while she was undressed, including when she was breastfeeding. While Lively and the article fail to mention is that Lively invited Baldoni into her trailer while pumping to work out their lines. Now, I've seen this in other contexts, and I've seen other people kind of talk about this, and they view it as a kind of checkmate because one of the accusations was that Baldoni and Heath were sneaking into her trailer to see her in various states of undress and making her uncomfortable. And this is an instance on June 3rd, 2023, where she says, I'm just pumping in my trailer if you want to work out our lines. And I think this is effective for purposes of the lawsuit. I don't think it's a get out of jail free card for the allegations on their own, because an invitation once is not an invitation for all time. And I could see essentially both of these circumstances being true. Yes, Baldoni was invited in once, but they took advantage and came in at other times where she was uncomfortable. And both of those things could exist in the same world. Now, we still have the problem with the video. We still have the problem with other potential hyperbolizations in an allegation, in a complaint document like we saw before. So reasonable minds can discount this all to the extent that they see fit. But I do think that this isn't a silver bullet. One invitation one time is not a carte blanche invitation into my trailer. And so I think this is useful, but not maybe the end of all things. Likewise, the allegation that Baldoni inappropriately described Lively's character attire as sexy is exaggerated and misleading. The text exchanges between Baldoni and Lively showed that Lively had insisted that her character clothing be much sexier. When Baldoni later used the word sexy, he was just responding to her creative input, not objectifying her personally. Lively set the tone that Baldoni heeded during the creative process. Now, one thing I want to say here as part of this paragraph is that this is a very tricky thing to claim, right? You're basically admitting your client did call her sexy in some respect, that is accurate. Some aspect of the allegation in the complaint document is true, but it's not what you think it is. And I think the lawyer does a very good job here of establishing what the difference is, right? You asked for it to be sexier. I used that same term, sexy, and this was not objectifying you personally. I'm trying to respond to what you had requested on a creative basis and not objectify you in that way. Again, discount as you see fit. This is a legal document alleging things just as much as the California document from Team Lively is. And so we have to look at this for the purposes of them telling a story, but they at least include the pictures of these signal messages for us to better understand. Blake Lively says, we'll show you both ways, but Beanie is much sexier. It's the look, feels TV without, especially with a crop top in the snow. It justifies the rest of the skin. And also is a girl I would check out walking down the street because it washes the effort off the rest of the look. Justin says, good morning, or gold morning. If you don't have time to listen with morning craziness, here is text. Just want to make sure, okay, with throwing the jacket on from yesterday morning or putting it on your. I want to line up a shot and see if I can just use a piece of the shoulder for the establishing shot, the old cafe we didn't get yesterday. I might not need it, but just want to cover. See you soon. Blake says, if it's just a shoulder, no problem. If it's her body or head, then it should be me. I was wondering about not having that shot, but kept to myself. Smiley emoji. Again, relatively collegial in this text exchange. Yeah, we ran out of time. I meant to line it up with the shoulder, and if it doesn't work, then when you're dressed, we'll figure it out. By the way, if you're ever wondering if we have a shot or need one, don't ever feel it's overstepping if you bring it up to me. For your information, Brandon just landed, and more on actually making a movie. But yes, again, for the Team Baldoni folks on this score, every interaction we have so far seen in this context is him being pretty genteel, right? Don't worry about overstepping. help me out on the direction. That's fine. You're the star, etc. All of this seems pretty accommodating. Now, there's no reason for them to post text exchanges, signal exchanges, whatever it might be, in a way that is deleterious to their client in this context. So we wouldn't expect to see them here. But we should note that, at least as described, of a situation of the entire production coming apart, of problems before the first day of filming, this does not appear on its face to be a director or man that is seeking to take advantage of Blake Lively in this context. Also misleading, the article draws on Lively's assertion that Baldoni improvised unwanted kissing and discussed his sex life. However, both the Times and Lively intentionally exclude that Lively refused to meet with the intimacy coordinator to plan out the film's sex scenes. Again, we can assume that something that bold, something that direct, it's easy to disprove if it's false, is not a lie in the context of a legal document being filed with the state of California. And so the fact that Lively refuses to meet with an intimacy coordinator when one of her claims as part of the things that she needed on set was an intimacy coordinator is a part of telling a story that Lively is essentially framing this all in a false light for purposes of the allegations that she is making. Baldoni, in turn, was forced to meet with the intimacy coordinator alone and relay any suggestions to Lively separately. Notwithstanding Baldoni's reluctance, he and Lively would later sketch out the scenes together, absent the intimacy coordinator. As part of those creative discussions, Baldoni and Lively sought to personalize and develop their characters, and in doing so, engaged in conversation about their individual experiences. Yes, one can imagine how that could happen if you're trying to figure out exactly how to frame out one of these scenes. You might talk about experiences that you had had. Again, not a movie maker, just a lowly corporate lawyer in the Midwest. But I can imagine how that would happen. And none of this, I never like thinking about how these things actually get up on screen for these purposes. But yes, one can imagine that to be true. The Times, taking Lively's CRD complaint as true, characterizes this discussion as an inappropriate attempt to Baldoni to talk about his sex life. It was not. More still, Baldoni consistently acted at the direction of the intimacy coordinator. These baseless accusations do not constitute sexual harassment. And again, the New York Times didn't really say that they did. They really do talk about the allegations there at the top of their article about what sexual harassment actually occurred. You really see the word alleged a lot more up at the top of this article than with respect to the quote-unquote smear campaign. But it is worth noting that anyone that reads this article would assume that Baldoni did these things because that's the basis on why the smear campaign exists. And so they're trying to drag all these things in together. Now, one of the issues you do have here is with that defamation concept, right? Let's go back to Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard for just one more minute. If you watch that case, you know that it was in fact Depp v. Heard, not Depp v. the Washington Post, even though it was the Washington Post that published the article that got Amber Heard in trouble. And so one of the reasons why it wasn't Johnny Depp versus the Washington Post is that the Washington Post didn't have great reason to believe that their author, Amber Heard, was lying to them. Now, this is one step removed from that, but to the extent Blake Lively provides a complaint that she's going to file with the state of California, and there are certain rules about what you're going to file with any state with respect to a complaint document, a lawsuit, or otherwise on truth-telling. It's one of the reasons we're reading this the way we are here in Hangouts and Headlines. Then if you're the New York Times, you have reason to believe in the truth value of what is asserted in that document. You should still be using alleged everywhere when you're reporting on these things. I don't think they do that enough. But because defamation requires knowing falsity with respect to figures of public interest, it does strike me that a defamation suit against the New York Times rather than Blake Lively on these grounds is one that's going to get you thrown out of court pretty quickly. Or said another way, if we look at the jury instructions in California, which I always like to do when we're looking at aspects of the law like the ones we're looking at here, you can see that the ruling here, and I've got per quad here, if you don't know the difference, defamation per se is defamation that is obviously damaging on its face. Defamation per quad is essentially lies that you have to prove the damages separately. They might be bringing this as a defamation per se claim in this context. It's not entirely clear in the document, as we will see in a minute. But however it goes, this is the part that we care about is going to be the same. So name of plaintiff, Justin Baldoni, claims that name of defendant, New York Times, harmed him by making one or more of the following statements. List all claim per quad defamatory statements. So you include giant sections of the article about a smear campaign. To establish this claim, Justin Baldoni must prove that all of the following are more likely true than not true. That the New York Times made one or more of the statements to a person other than Justin Baldoni. We know this. They published an article about it, that this person, these people, reasonably understood that the statements were about Justin Baldoni. Yes, readers of the article in the New York Times on December 21st, 2024 would have known they were about Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer. That because of the facts and circumstances known to readers of the statements, they tended to injure Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer in his occupation or expose him to hatred, contempt, ridicule, or shame, or discourage others from associating or dealing with him. And we know this to be the case because, as we saw in the New York Times article itself, Justin Baldoni lost his job or lost his agent, which is kind of like losing your job in the world of movie making, as part of this article going out. On Saturday, after this article was published, the talent agency William Morris Endeavor stopped representing Mr. Baldoni, said Ari Emanuel, chief executive of Endeavor, the agency's parent company. And so we're already seeing most of this come together. But number 4, the statements were false, that Justin Baldoni suffered harm to his property, business, profession, or occupation, and that the statements were a substantial factor in causing that harm. In addition, with respect to public figures, Justin Baldoni must prove by clear and convincing evidence that the New York Times knew the statements were false or had serious doubts about the truth of the statements. So what you can see here in this lawsuit is that Justin Baldoni's representatives are trying to essentially bootstrap that claim by the New York Times that they had read through what may have been all the texts and emails that backstopped the complaint in California. And if they did that, then they would have known that all this other information was out there. The truth of the matter seems more likely to me to be that the New York Times never had access to all of those backing materials, really only looked at the complaint and said, through the nature of some kind of pronouns and ambiguous language, that they had looked through the complaint rather than everything else as part of their review here, and wound up regurgitating the complaint. But does that reach the level of defamation in California? I personally think it probably does not, but reasonable minds can differ there. The bigger issue is, as we discussed earlier, that California has a very strict anti-SLAPP law. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, a SLAPP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, which is just a terrible way of saying it's a lawsuit designed to stop you from speaking on something, right? And defamation, as we've talked about in this space and with respect to Depp v. Heard and other places, is a legal kind of claim that does go against your First Amendment freedom of speech in some way. Now, the freedom of speech is subject to these various rules: defamation, lies that harm people, that kind of thing. But because it's so kind of confrontational, that a defamation case is so much anti the spirit of being free to speak your mind on these things, a number of jurisdictions, including the state of California, have put special rules together that say you are going to be even more quickly thrown out of court if we view what you are claiming to be essentially a lawsuit designed to use the expense and time of the court system to keep people from talking about you or to talk about statements of public interest. So in California, the way this works is they say a cause of action against a person arising from any act of that person in furtherance of the person's right of free speech under the United States Constitution or in connection with a public issue shall be subject to a special motion to strike unless the court determines that the plaintiff has established that there is a probability that the plaintiff will prevail on the claim, right? And there are always motions to dismiss at the top of lawsuits based on various other rules. This takes that threshold and makes it even stronger. Says your motion to dismiss is more likely to succeed. Why? Because a court has to determine that you will prevail on the claim, and in making the determination, the court shall only consider the pleadings and supporting and opposing affidavits stating facts upon which liability or defense is based. We're not going to discovery. We're not going to have any evidentiary collection on this. You have to say in the document we are looking at today, in the lawsuit that we have before us, that this is enough to survive a claim that you didn't reach the threshold for proving defamation. So in other words, the lawsuit that we were just looking at actually has to be enough on its face to say that the New York Times knew what it was saying was false. And I think there is so much space for the New York Times to say, no, we didn't have access to those things. No, we didn't know it was false. Yes, we have every right to take as true allegations in a legal document that is being filed with a state agency that otherwise has obligations to speak true to that agency. And no, we don't have an obligation to Justin Baldoni or anyone else to do the deepest dive in the history of journalism just because he wants us to. And I think that's probably a winning argument for the Times. And based on California as the jurisdiction, that probably gets this kicked out of court before anybody has discovery, before this goes anywhere. And I think Team Baldoni knows that, right? We will see in just a minute, but they self-selected for California as their jurisdiction when they didn't have to. And part of this is because they want this story to get out there. They want me and others talking about it in this context as a response to the complaint document leaked to the New York Times and the article that the New York Times put out there. But they know that this is very unlikely to go through a full litigation process because it's very expensive, that's very time consuming. And what they really want is to get their message out there without going through that process. And they're fine with an anti-SLAPP lawsuit, an anti-SLAPP motion kicking this out of court. One presumes, because I also presume based on this writing, based on the lawyers involved here, that they aren't idiots, that they know that California is a specific choice that they made here for strategic purposes, and that this is very likely to get kicked out in that specific jurisdiction. Despite its effort to craft a distorted narrative, the Times fails to address a glaring contradiction in Lively's CRD complaint. After the execution of the Protections for Return to Production Agreement in November 2023, Lively herself acknowledges that the film was completed, marketed, and released safely and successfully. While Wayfarer, Baldoni, and Heath disagreed with Lively's rationale for requesting the document, many of its provisions were already standard practice, they chose to comply for the sake of the film and to ensure Lively's comfort. And this is also what we said as part of what the New York Times described and what the complaint describes at the top of its kind of description of events related to this film, that listing of however many complaints they had, that you shall not talk to me about your sex life, you shall not show me pornographic videos, etc., was assuming the accuracy of those allegations, essentially, just because the studio said, yes, we will have an intimacy coordinator on set. Yes, we agree not to do those things because we effectively think we never did those things. And so this is another area where the lawyers for a studio, the lawyers for a person might say, you got to be careful what you sign. You got to be careful what you agree to, even if logically you can say, yes, your statement of complaints is crazy, but we're okay with your proposed solutions to them, because that statement of crazy complaints might well be used against you in a court of law or in a California Civil Rights Department or anywhere else, right? When we talk about things like the right to silence in respect of police and criminal accusations, that right to remain silent is because you don't realize exactly what you say or agree to, even tacitly, how it might be perceived later on. And this is one of those cases where when you are in an HR fight that was happening here, and Blake Lively's team proposes this list of things that you think might well be crazy, or at least is complained of by your lawyer here as effectively crazy. We disagree with the rationale for requesting the document as put forth here in legalese, that even signing on to the solutions that you're otherwise okay with might well wind up in a complaint document. Crucially, Lively concedes that neither Baldoni nor Heath engaged in any harassing behavior following the agreement in November 2023. Furthermore, she admits that her stated concerns were sufficiently addressed at that time. This admission directly undermines her allegations of retaliation and strips her claims of credibility. I'm not sure I agree with this. Without the fabricated smear campaign narrative propping up her CRD complaint, Lively's retaliation claim collapses under its own contradictions, exposing it as yet another ploy to salvage her public image rather than pursue any legitimate grievance. So they're trying to frame this as, because everything was fine after that side letter was entered into, then there's no reason to believe that there was a smear campaign. There's no reason to believe that Lively and her prior harassment claims were accurate. I don't think that's correct, because I think it's easy enough to frame a story that says they were bad guys, they were doing these bad things. I am correct in what I had to say. I'm correct in what I asked for if I'm on Team Lively here. And yes, they fixed themselves up. But just because they fix themselves up doesn't mean it didn't happen to begin with. I wasn't in a hostile workplace environment to begin with. And so I think that this paragraph is maybe not the strongest in the Baldoni lawsuit. The fact is that Lively embarked on a hostile takeover of the production, strong-arming Sony into blessing her with ultimate control. As they became increasingly frantic and unsettled by the usurpation of their roles, Baldoni remained resolute that they continue to take the high road and be proud of the beautiful baby they had all made together. Lawyers, don't ever write beautiful baby they had all made together. It's not a good look for us. Notwithstanding, Lively waged war on Baldoni, weaponizing innocuous interactions from May and June 2023, long before there was any tension between them, to vilify and discredit him. At the time, Baldoni and Lively had a solid working relationship, and Lively expressed no unease around him. Only after the writer's strike had ended and filming was set to resume did Lively express any concern about returning to set. In response, Wayfarer and Baldoni agreed to all of Lively's demands. And that's the start of the complaint document, the start of the New York Times article, as we looked at in part one. This is the end of the introduction for the lawsuit. We're going to go more into jurisdiction and persons involved and the facts that underline what they're claiming here as part of this read through. But I do want to take a beat here before we go on to the next part to talk to you all about comments and questions that you might have about what we have read so far. So, folks, do you have anything right now? I need to rest my voice for just a minute. Please do let me know. I will be monitoring the chat right this second. We do have an interesting conversation here happening behind the scenes where Inigo says, Katerina Gadecki, I'm fairly certain that the suit was DOA in either state. It may have just been cheaper since Wayfair, Baldoni et al. Are in California. That is an aspect of this, right? One of the reasons that you do file a suit in your locale where you're already living is that it is, generally speaking, more efficient, easier to access the court system where you are geographically located, and they do appear to be operating in California. But they had a lot of choices here, right? One of the things we will see as we move on with this lawsuit document is that there's a lot of different jurisdictions that are represented, a lot of different states, a lot of different people living in different places, a lot of different companies operating in different locations. And when you have that, you always have the option of pursuing a federal claim, right? The United States is a jurisdiction of multiple entities that have authority over specific places. So if you are operating in Los Angeles, if you're operating in the state of California, you could pursue a claim in the state of California. You could also pursue a claim in federal courts located in the state of California. And so that's a part of this story as well. Notably, the U.S. federal government does not have an anti-SLAPP statute because the U.S. federal government is where most First Amendment claims actually wound up residing. And I don't think Congress has had the appetite to really pick that up and have those fights at the federal level. But when you bring a federal claim on that basis, you might have a little bit more luck getting into a stage where you are getting discovery, where you are getting access to evidence, unlike in California, unlike in New York. New York also has a pretty strong anti-SLAPP statute. And so when we're talking about jurisdiction, we cannot forget that federal court was an option. It's in fact an option that we will later on see Blake Lively take as her choice of jurisdiction. The federal court maybe doesn't have the same level of publicity, doesn't have the same access that influencers and social media might like it to have, which might be the reason she chose that. I can't speak to all of the behind-the-scenes strategies on all these things, but jurisdictional choice is always a part of a litigation strategy. You're always looking at the various courts that you could pursue your claim in. You're always looking at where it might be best to file your claim. And in this case, the state of California, the court system was their choice. And I think it's a choice that likely belies the fact that they don't necessarily want to go through an entire litigation on this score. Catherine Frazier says, I do get the sense that there was a lot of placating going on during the filming of the movie. Even the HR meeting seems like a phatic gesture. It was a chess move to call for that meeting, in my opinion. I think it's easy enough to look at this set of facts and say what we have here is a trying, egotistical actor seeking some kind of refuge, some kind of placation, whether it's in meetings or otherwise. I do think that the communications we have so far seen from Justin Baldoni indicate a desire to placate his actor. It doesn't mean there isn't more going on behind the scenes, but I think it is easy enough to come to that conclusion. And I do say this. I lean that direction, if only because that's how I see Ryan Reynolds acting in Hollywood. That's how I view his interactions with the Deadpool franchise, what happened with respect to creative decisions on that franchise, how I've seen him operate in other contexts. And I do have certain notions that being someone's spouse tends to rub off on you, or that you become spouses because you already have a shared affinity of some kind. So I do want to say that because I am thinking that in the background here, but that isn't entirely fair because it's entirely speculative on what are essentially my vibes regarding the personhood of Ryan Reynolds. And so I get that impression as well, Catherine, but I think that's informative and not necessarily dispositive. Don says, hi, Hoeg. Hi, Don Leinart. Good to see you here. I appreciate it. Captain Marvel is Brie Larson, since you missed it earlier. Yep, sometimes you just can't come up with those names. Captain Marvel is Brie Larson. I am one of maybe the few on the internet who's willing to say I actually have enjoyed Brie Larson in a lot of her pictures. I liked her, especially before Captain Marvel. But she undoubtedly got pilloried after taking on that role and making some statements in various contexts that I did see on YouTube. I did see in other contexts of floating of other interviews and other things that she had said that could be viewed through that prism, through that perspective. So I do understand how actors and others might find themselves to be the unfair victims of a snowballing public relations snafu. Hoeg, it's pronounced like Inigo Montoya. I appreciate it. I thought it might be, but I didn't want to make the guess. So thank you. Yes, I will try not to just randomly repeat Princess Bride comments when you comment. I really appreciate you jumping in. Renata says, our team plan to plant stories and say Baldoni wants stronger action. Sony complained to Jennifer Abel. She blames Stephanie Jones. Phone is seized for PR team statement denying doing anything. Certainly the PR team is denying doing anything in a lot of respects. I think there's a lot going on here. I think one thing we're going to come to the end of this video and probably the end of this series understanding is that this is a very real PR battle with very well-resourced sides arguing things that we can't actually know the truth value of just based on what we can see from the outside. We can have vibes, right? We can have understanding. I think Blake Lively probably does act a little bit like Ryan Reynolds, and I think Ryan Reynolds acts very poorly in a lot of contexts. And that's how I am perceiving this. That's not the only way you can perceive these things. And certainly what Blake Lively alleges in that complaint to the state of California is bad, as I said in part one, right? If Justin Baldoni is behaving exactly as reported in that complaint, if Jamie Heath is acting exactly as reported in that complaint, that does appear to be a hostile work environment. That does appear to be a legitimate sexual harassment type complaint to me, looking at things from the outside. But as a lawyer, I would never look at a complaint document, a set of allegations, even a lawsuit filed like this one, as the be-all, end-all. You don't know even half of what you should know until at least a response document has been filed by the other side in any of these contexts, and we don't have that to react to right now. Now we're looking at a picture in the lawsuit itself that talks about the fact that they are not getting to see Blake Lively's cut of the film. So we saw at the end of their introduction, I believe it was the end of their introduction, they might have a little bit more, that one of their assertions here is that Blake Lively was doing all of this to seize control of the creative output of the film. As we talked about in part one, that is a part of this story. That gives motive to the PR fight. That gives motive to why this might be happening in a way that makes more sense than just Blake Lively deciding to take down a random person in a random studio for whom she performed work. And so if she wanted creative control, it could look like this, where you try to make everybody the bad guy against you and you take that creative control for yourself. I'm not saying that's what happened because I don't know. We do know that Blake Lively did get a certain amount of creative control, and we do have these internal conversations with Justin Baldoni and his editors that say, have you peeked at her cut? The editor says, I've been told that we are not permitted to look. And Justin Baldoni says, the editors and director aren't allowed to look at an actress's cut. Got it. Well, here we go. We will keep taking the high road. And again, he seems like a fairly passive guy on these kinds of things. Obviously, we can imagine that that would be driving you nuts if you're the director and you're supposed to have this creative control of your project. Your name's going to be on it, and you're not getting that control because of forces outside of your control, like Sony, who's distributing your film. But he does actually have here in writing, we will keep taking the high road. That's a good find by his legal team. To suggest, as the Times does, that plaintiffs engaged in dark arts to destroy Lively's reputation is to ignore that Lively had long-standing reputational challenges and that plaintiffs' public relations efforts were rudimentary, above board, and entirely defensive. And again, you see here some rhetoric from the Baldoni legal side. We are going to so discount what they're alleging happened here. We're going to call it dark arts to make it obvious that this didn't happen. The Times willingly omits any meaningful discussion of the true source of tension between Lively and plaintiffs, which was Lively's brazen and calculated effort to expropriate the film. This is crazy. She doesn't have a good reputation. All of this is organic stuff from real people making TikToks, not bots, again, from Nathan. We made a beautiful baby together. The baby might not grow up tone exactly who we thought, but it's still beautiful. That's what I'm holding on to. Very proud of us. Justin Baldoni, again, saying what's best for the movie is that I suck it up and let her in. Editor one, the last I heard was that she was putting back a fair amount of our version, just not sure what that entailed or to what extent. I guess you'll find out today. So we do have Some of the interactions we know would have happened because Lively did take control of the cut of the film. We saw that referenced in the New York Times article, and these are the editors and director talking about that fact. The Times' assertion that plaintiffs orchestrated a campaign to tarnish Lively's reputation blatantly disregards her bizarre behavior at the time and misrepresents plaintiffs' actions, which were modest, transparent, and purely defensive. The article entirely sidesteps the real source of conflict between Lively and plaintiffs, Lively's calculated and audacious attempt to seize control of the film. A little repetition here, but again, I believe they think that they have a flood of information to put out there, so they're okay being repetitive, which is not great rhetorically because they want to emphasize how much they have to show the court. Notably, absent from the Times narrative is Lively's insistence on obtaining editing privileges and demanding her own version of the film, a departure from industry standards. As we talked about in part one, creative control is something that you can negotiate for as part of your contracts, just like anything else. That tends to lower something else that you might be getting, whether it's salary, back end, or otherwise. And it is clear that that was not negotiated in advance. And so this does appear to be a certain kind of coup to take control of the film. Even more egregiously, Lively leveraged her promotional commitments to pressure for the release of her cut. Evidence of Baldoni's efforts to accommodate Lively's demands, including a series of text exchanges with editors who were later replaced by Lively in favor of her husband's editor, there's Ryan Reynolds again, underscores the extreme lengths Baldoni went to in order to preserve the film's integrity. The Times' willful omission of these critical details not only distorts the truth, but also perpetuates a false narrative that conveniently absolves Lively of her own culpability in the unraveling of professional relationships and the upheaval surrounding the film. Now, I think this is well said from a storytelling perspective. I think legally, again, the New York Times is in a libel suit here. They don't have an obligation to present every possible angle of a story. And so I don't actually think that they needed to triply emphasize the seizure of the studio. I think it does appear in their article towards the end, and you can reflect on that as you desire to. You can give it the weight that you see fit. And it is not illegal that the authors of the article did not weight it the way that Justin Baldoni might have wanted it to be weighted. That said, I continue to think that the New York Times based this article on the complaint itself, and perhaps that is not the most ethical way to report on this story in its entirety. And I can't even scroll. This article is so long down to where they talk about Lively taking control of the studio. I might have passed it, but that is in there. And we talked about it in part one. And I do think it's important to understand the legal obligation versus maybe the ethical, moral, or publicity-based obligations. And here, the lawyers are kind of conflating that. That's okay. That's part of the storytelling here. The court is probably not going to rely on the notion that the New York Times had to report X, Y, and Z in order to be legal. Also missing from the article is Lively's demand for an unearned producer credit and coveted PGA mark, a demand that Wayfarer and Baldoni were forced to concede under duress, as documented internally. And they've got letters amongst each other talking about the PGA mark. Moreover, the article fails to address the fact that Baldoni was systematically sidelined from the marketing of his own film. And again, these are all aspects of the lawsuit that tell a story. The New York Times are bad people. They're bad actors. You should punish them because they are bad, but not necessarily speaking to the actual legal obligations here. Yet Lively drastically limited his input and deliberately steered the promotional campaign away from its societal message. Further undermining Baldoni's role, Lively initially refused to permit his attendance at the film's premiere. Only after significant pressure did she reluctantly agree to allow Baldoni and the Wayfarer team to attend, but under humiliating conditions. The Wayfarer team and their families, including Baldoni and Heath, were segregated from the main cast, barred from the exclusive after party, and forced to organize their own event at additional cost. That's remarkable for their own movie. Baldoni's participation on the red carpet was cut short, and his family and friends were confined to a makeshift holding area in the basement before being escorted into a separate theater after Lively's departure. Not only had Lively stolen the film, but she also robbed Baldoni and his team of any genuine opportunity to celebrate their hard work. And again, this is court of public opinion stuff, just as we talked about with respect to the seizure itself. This looks bad for Blake Lively. This is designed to make you feel bad about the New York Times and their reporting. This is all good for a public relations war. Not so interesting from the legal perspective. Jen Abel says, nothing we can't get through together. This film will be successful. She has always promoted heavily, so if she backs away now, it will look worse for her. And you just focus on the bigger picture of how this film is going to change the game for you in the studio. Hey, look, we're going to make a lot of money. You're going to be famous after this. Probably not in the way that they expected, but don't worry about Blake Lively. Justin Baldoni says, just find ways to keep me busy when she gets everyone together. Obviously, if the whole cast is making content together, that's her trying to clue people onto there being an issue. Everything she does is calculated, yet also manic. It's interesting that they highlighted this one because you can read this as there being a sexual harassment issue, even though that's certainly not the intent of the Baldoni team here. attempting to rewrite history, and like I'm not the one who developed this and spent 5 years trying to make it. And like there's an issue with me. It's just mean and hurtful, and she knows exactly what she's doing. Again, there's hurt feelings here, right? These are actual people. It's easy enough for us to talk about stories like this as celebrities fighting amongst themselves, as the New York Times against Hollywood, East versus West, all people with giants striding around the United States without a care in the world. But these are actual human beings, and Justin Baldoni is at least expressing internally here that his feelings are hurt. And one could imagine that if this is as he is presenting it, then you would have your feelings hurt too. He had an infection in his spine. He's talking with his editors. The amount of women who feel seen as part of this movie, it's reaching people all over the world. Men are remembering their own traumas and having conversations with their partners. That's why we did this, and it worked. Still the dream team. Incredible. That's the best news. Exactly the most important thing. They're still excited about their movie even after it comes out and it is taken over by Blake Lively. If you decide to change your mind last minute, let me know and let's figure it out together. I'm going to be there. It's just different timing and holding areas and theaters and all the things you can imagine. It's still our film. Editor says it would be very hard for me to sit and watch the final film for the first time at the premiere. Just cheer for us when our names come up. Sending all the love. Okay, yeah, I haven't seen it either, says Justin Baldoni. Like the actual cut of the movie was taken from them and not shown to them. When Wayfarer and Baldoni hired Lively to appear in the film, they did not anticipate that she would execute a hostile takeover of the entire project. Lively's cynical abuse of sexual harassment allegations to assert unilateral control over every aspect of the production was both strategic and manipulative. All right, I want to stop here for just a second because this is important to me. I said this during Depp v. Heard, but one of the reasons why I really grew to dislike what Heard was doing in that particular context was that it was very hard for me to believe that anybody would lie about such heinous things because they are such important things for us to correct in society, such important things for us to actually be worried about, right? Me Too was legitimately important because there are skis-balls that take advantage of power differentials and bad employee situations and take advantage of people. And that's an important thing to try to get corrected and booted out of society. But when you lie about it, when you take advantage of it for cynical or manipulative reasons, then you undermine our ability to do that, right? Because it's easy enough for bad actors to say, well, this is just another Heard situation. This is just another Lively situation, whatever it might be. And I don't know whether this is the case, but as presented in this story, in the Baldoni lawsuit, if this is what happened, then Lively using harassment and sexuality complaints in this fashion is, to me, one of the biggest affronts you can do to the justice system, to criminal justice in the United States, right? This is bad. You don't lie about these things because it takes away from the people that are actually affected. It takes away from the actual victims, and it makes everyone more vulnerable to legitimately bad actors out there in the world. So if this is true, what Baldoni is saying, if what Lively is saying in her allegations is not true, then that to me is a heinous affront to my notions of justice and to my notions of what should be happening in the world and in these respects. And I hate that. I want us to live in a just society that can better protect the most vulnerable among us. I want people to be able to go and make complaints when complaints are justified, and to be able to go forward and protect themselves through the very, very costly and time-consuming systems that we have available to them right now. And if that is not happening here, if this is as described by Justin Baldoni, honestly, it hurts me to my core. That is the kind of thing that I think really takes away, obviously, from Baldoni and Wayfarer themselves for being accused of these heinous things, but also from everybody else that might find themselves in a circumstance where they really need to avail themselves of these mechanisms, whether it's the California court system, the Civil Rights Department, federal lawsuits, whatever it might be, because that ground is being salted as we speak, as we watch these things happen. So continuing with this paragraph, simultaneously, her public image suffered as a result of a series of high-profile blunders, which she tried to deflect by blaming plaintiffs for the public's prying interest into the foibles of an A-list celebrity. This is nothing but an excuse. Fame is a double-edged sword, but Lively's tactics here are unconscionable. Alongside the Times, she orchestrated a malicious attack on the reputations, careers, and personal lives of plaintiffs, subjecting them to public humiliation, threats, and vitriol. This lawsuit seeks to hold the Times accountable for its role in this defamation campaign, but plaintiffs are not done. There are other bad actors involved, and make no mistake, this will not be the last lawsuit. God help us. So we don't have another Baldoni lawsuit right this second, but they have said they're going to have others, presumably against Lively and her team more directly. But this is essentially a threat at the end of their introduction, which I thought ended 6 paragraphs ago, but has not yet ended. And here we are in parties and jurisdiction. So let's once again take a short break to catch our breath, to realize what we've already heard from the Baldoni side, and then we'll get into the jurisdiction and the actual factual claims here. As I check the comments, make sure I haven't missed any super chats or anything else. Sandy, thank you so much for gifting 10 Hoeg Law memberships. I really, really appreciate it quite a lot. We can't do it without support from people like you. If you're listening to this after the fact, comments are great. You don't have to super chat. Anything else you want to do to share these conversations with friends, all of that is helpful. Thank you so much, Sandy. And I hope everybody that got one of these gifted memberships is also having fun, enjoying the various different emojis and things that we have on the membership tier here at the channel. I intend to add more to those in the near future. But as you might have known over the past couple of years, I kind of don't have the same infrastructure of freelancers and others that have helped me put those things together in the past, owing to my somewhat circuitous route back to live streaming, back to video making after my medical emergency at the end of 2022. And so I'm working to get back at that. But for right now, thank you so much, Sandy. I really appreciate it so much. Mariko says, convict all the PR firms and send Lively and Baldoni back to middle school for maturation purposes. I'm only slightly joking. I'm not sure what we would convict them of. Again, this is the job of PR, right? There's nothing really wrong with having a public reputation and having some company or set of professionals that you hire and pay money to help try to defend that. Where it becomes wrong is if you are spreading lies, if you're spreading malicious conduct, and that becomes unethical more than illegal in most contexts. But PR as a whole is essentially a necessary aspect of operating in the year 2025. So I understand that it can look icky, if you will, in certain respects, and I can agree to that. But I don't think it's bad to have PR out there. I think it's unusual to see giant PR firms and giant PR battles like this one, which is one of the reasons we're covering it here, so I can have these conversations with you all. But I wouldn't convict them of anything. Sending Lively and Baldoni back to middle school for maturation might well be justified. It's entirely unclear to me exactly how true the various things that are being said in these two documents actually are. So that's part of why we would hope to get some concrete information out of this process, but not likely in this lawsuit that we're reading today. We've got various people in the chat talking about various aspects of what we have to believe about accusations and whatnot, all of which I think is useful, good, reasonable minds can differ kind of conversation. I think reasonable minds can differ even more significantly on aspects of this that touch our personal lives, touch really the personal lives of all of us. I would imagine that there are people in the chat right now, people that will be watching this later on, that have experienced at bare minimum discomfort in their employment settings, whether it's of a sexual nature or otherwise. And I would hope that we as people can continue to seek to have that eliminated. People can go too far. Laws can go too far. Complaints can go too far. Lying can get all of this in trouble, as we just talked about. But I would hope that folks that watch this video, folks that listen to this channel, would all have at least the reasoned concept that we would prefer people to not have to be harassed, not have to be put into uncomfortable positions based on their power levels at their state of work in their employment context. Jade says, I just think she's surrounded by yes men. How no one in her PR didn't tell her selling booze along with the domestic violence movie is tone deaf. My aunt suffered when her husband went out drinking. That's too bad, Jade. I'm very sorry to hear that. And I tend to agree. I tend to agree that what appears to be happening here is that Blake Lively is the president of Blake Lively, Inc., right? And you would expect that. You would expect the people that she hires to control her PR and the various hangers-on that she might otherwise have are beholden to Celebrity Inc., as it might be. But yeah, I do think that can get you into trouble. And I do think that grab your friends, wear your florals, and while you buy my booze is maybe not the best way to sell a domestic violence facing movie. And I do think that that wound up hurting her. And I think that she was upset at the fact that it hurt her and formulated some of the complaint based on that upsetness. You see some of the complaint talk about the fact that the marketing strategy talked about advocating the good, not highlighting the bad of this particular movie. And you could understand how someone might come to the conclusion that wear your florals and drink my booze is the way to do that, but it's not a great idea. It's not a good way to do that. And unfortunately, I think that like any other industry, acting, Hollywood has people that maybe are a little bit tone deaf, aren't great at controlling public relations. And if you hire people to help you and they only have to say yes to you, that you can get into more trouble than if they were honest with you. And unfortunately, we see that across all industries, right? We see that certainly in Southeast Michigan. We see that in tech. We see that in healthcare. We see that in everywhere. People are people. There are people that are better at certain things, people that are worse at certain things. And there are people that are egotistical and narcissistic. And I don't know whether Blake Lively is one of those people. I don't know whether Ryan Reynolds is one of those people, really. But I know that the vibes he gives off make me think that he is. Bunch of people saying thank you to me. I really appreciate it. That's very nice of you, Joe. Thank you, Rick. Love your take on these. Heart emoji. April says, Rick, you appreciate it and I enjoy your content. Thank you, April. I really appreciate everybody that helps support these conversations. I feel like I can add value to the world by talking about these things in the context that I'm familiar with. The law, media, critiques, critical readings of various things. And that is very, very important to me. So I really appreciate it if they are resonating with you. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for all of the support. Beth B says it's exciting to watch this entire debacle unfold, seeing the Hollywood curtain pulled back. Cat Williams told us it would happen. Smiley face emoji. I do think that there is some usefulness to even going through this process if you just follow any of this on the outside, right? I watch a lot of movies. I love culture. I love seeing media get made. And I do think, even though we know kind of intrinsically that there are these manipulations, there are these kinds of massage points for what gets reported in somewhere like the New York Times, the Washington Post, wherever it might be, it is good and useful for all of us to be able to see behind the curtain a little bit, to use some Wizard of Oz parlance or Wicked parlance for being a little bit more formal, a little bit more modern. And I think it is useful for us to understand that this is not the only time this is happening. Lively versus Baldoni is not the only time that celebrities and PR or marketing strategies are out there trying to control, trying to influence what it is that we think about a product, what it is that we think about a person. And so it's important to understand that when we go through anything. That's really what Hangouts and Headlines is about. That's why this series so far has been in Hangouts and Headlines, even though we're going page by page through a lawsuit right now. Speaking of which, let's head back into the lawsuit land. We're looking at the parties and jurisdiction. As I mentioned, there are people from everywhere here. Plaintiff Wayfarer Studios is at all relevant times herein a Delaware limited liability company with its principal place of business in the county of Los Angeles, state of California. That would give it the option really of suing in either location, although you don't usually sue in your jurisdiction of formation or organization because you're probably not operating there. You're using a resident agent. There's a whole bunch of corporate stuff that we don't need to get into for purposes of this conversation, but just keep track of the number of states that we see because you just need 2 to make a federal case. Delaware, California. Plaintiff Justin Baldoni is an individual residing in Los Angeles, California. Jamie Heath is in Los Angeles, California. Steve Sarowitz is in Lake County, Illinois. Financier is in the Midwest. Plaintiff Melissa Nathan is in Los Angeles, California. Her agency group, one presumes, is in Los Angeles, California. Jennifer Abel is in Los Angeles, California. So a lot of folks in Los Angeles, California that can go to inform where you file suit. Because again, there is a certain level of reduction in friction for suing where you're already located. RWA Communications is a limited liability company with its place of business in Los Angeles, California. Jed Wallace is in Hays County, Texas. Plaintiff Street Relations, Inc. is in Hays County, Texas. So that's Jed Wallace's company. The New York Times is doing business in New York, New York. And you might say, all right, but you're suing the New York Times. You're dragging them over to California. How did you get them into California? Well, one, we're in California. We're affected in California. That helps. The other thing that helps here is that the New York Times, as essentially a global newspaper that uses the internet, is producing its content, what would be defamatory, right? That's the accusation, everywhere that you can read it on the internet. So I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on where jurisdiction lies here, but suffice to say, California is almost certainly going to have jurisdiction over this case. It would be odd for them to reject it just because the New York Times is in New York. Jurisdiction is proper, since at least some of the obligations, liabilities, and breaches complained of herein arose or occurred in the county of Los Angeles, right? Defamation occurs at the publishing of the writing. It also affects the subject of the writing. So they've got California covered in two ways. Venue as to each of the defendants is proper in the judicial district pursuant to California Code of Civil Procedure. We're not going to go into civil procedure stuff. Since at least some of the obligations, liabilities, and breaches complained of herein arose or occurred in the county of Los Angeles. Each of the defendants either owns, maintains offices, transacts business, has an agent or agents within the county of Los Angeles, or otherwise is found within the county of Los Angeles, and each of the defendants is within the jurisdiction of this court for purposes of service of process. New York Times maintains a process server in Los Angeles, so they don't have any complaints about not knowing about this lawsuit. Then we get into the facts, right? And going back to jurisdiction for just a minute before we get into those facts, again, it's important to understand that they made the choice to file in California. They could have filed in New York. They could have filed a federal case, and they chose California instead. That's its own strategic choice. I tend to think that's because they don't actually want this case to move forward as much as they wanted this information out there in the world, right? And I'm sure that they would love to win a case. They'd love to win $250 million. But this, to me, reads is more about getting this messaging out there because the messaging of the New York Times article and the complaint being leaked was, in their view, so damaging to their clients. In or about early 2019, Baldoni, through his literary agent, contacted the author of the book on which the film is based, which I believe is Colleen Hoover. He expressed a deep interest in adapting the book into a feature-length motion picture that aligned with his history of impactful storytelling. Baldoni envisioned a film that would shed light on the struggles of domestic violence survivors, amplify their voices, and inspire social change. Driven by his unwavering commitment, often at significant personal sacrifice, Baldoni ensured the film stayed true to his vision, ultimately achieving its purpose. That's interesting insofar as we just looked at all the things that said that he didn't have final cut on the movie. On or about May 8th, 2019, Wayfarer secured an option for the book rights with the intent of creating a film that would bring critical attention to the widespread issue of intimate partner violence. Over the next 5 years of development, Baldoni and Wayfarer maintained a strong and collaborative relationship with the book's author. With the rights to the book secured and a plan to finance the project, Wayfarer committed to producing the film. Baldoni, whose passion and creative vision were central to the project, would direct and star in it. And again, you see some of this kind of puffery. This is a storytelling device, right? We don't need to know that his passion and creative vision were central to the project, but we are trying to establish as lawyers in this document, New York Times bad, right? New York Times didn't even allow us 14 hours to respond to their request of this huge defamatory article. And our guy is just interested in passion and creative vision in order to better help folks understand the issue of intimate partner violence. Our guy, good guy. Their guys, bad guys. Wayfarer partnered with Sony to co-finance and distribute the film. That agreement included, at Wayfarer's and Baldoni's assistance, a requirement that 1% of the film's proceeds be donated to survivors of domestic violence. Presumably this is a typo. Presumably this is Wayfarer's and Baldoni's insistence. They insisted that 1% of the film's proceeds go to survivors of domestic violence. I don't understand what they would be assisting here. I don't think they're helping Sony do that. They asked Sony to do it, and Sony agreed. That 1% was ultimately earmarked for the organization No More, with which Baldoni had wanted to partner as early as September 2022. So part of the story they're telling now is Baldoni was really interested in domestic violence as a subject, and as part of the initial contract with his distributor, mandated that 1% of the movie money went to a nonprofit. On or about December 31st, 2022, Lively agreed to take on the lead role of Lily Bloom. As part of the subsequent negotiations, Lively was granted an executive producer credit, a title often associated with talent of her stature. Yes, if you look at the credits to a movie, you'll often see the stars being named executive producers. Wayfarer did not request that Lively contribute to the film in any capacity beyond her performance and this credit. Step 1, Lively takes over wardrobe. On or about May 15th, 2023, principal photography of the film commenced in New Jersey. During pre-production, Lively began to assert control over aspects of the film beyond her role as an actor and outside the scope of her contractual entitlements. While lead actors are sometimes granted approval over the general look of their on-screen character, this authority typically does not include full control over wardrobe decisions without input from the director and producers. The people funding the movie generally get to decide how it looks. Nevertheless, Lively overstepped these boundaries, sidelining the production's costume designer, a seasoned professional with long-standing working relationship with Lively. And if you're wondering now, Rick, aren't we a little far afield of the New York Times committing libel in this particular lawsuit? We are, right? Because we are in the storytelling aspect of the facts. Baldoni's a good guy. He wanted to talk about domestic violence. Lively, bad, taking over everything. Ignoring the director's vision for her character and disregarding the weeks spent by the entire team shopping and thoughtfully creating her wardrobe in preparation for filming, Lively would send hundreds of images to the film's costume designer during all hours of the evening. pointing them in the direction of the appearance she wanted for her character. And again, a more benign reading of that could be that she was really invested in the movie, right? This is an actress that really wants to make sure that this movie is done right. That's the way you might frame this if you're writing the opposite version of this document. The costume designer then had to reshop her wardrobe, far exceeding the allocated budget and diverting time and resources. At one point, Lively insisted that her character had money and could afford $5,000 shoes, which had Baldoni rethinking the entire script that had been worked on for well over a year and had been approved by both studios. Not sure what that has to do with anything. Lively asked for more expensive shoes, and Baldoni rethought the entire script as a result. Lively also several times refused to participate in wardrobe fittings at the production office, a mere 15 minutes away from Lively's Tribeca residence. So again, this is a diva, Your Honor, and she was upending the entire production process from the moment she set foot in production on this. Instead, she insisted the costume department pack up the wardrobe department and deliver all her wardrobe items to her. Loading the wardrobe department on trucks and delivering them to Lively's residence for fittings added both time to the production schedule and expense to the film. Two things productions work hard to avoid with careful planning. Yeah, time is money, money is time. These demands were never mentioned at the contract negotiation phase and therefore were not included in the budget. Lively, herself having a further obligation to the studios as an executive producer, paid no mind to the budget and the months of planning that had already occurred. Now, this is stealing a base a little bit, right? We just established that executive producer is just a title given to people of her talent level, of her stature, and was not expected to have her do basically any producing of the movie. So then trying to hoist on this particular petard rings a little bit false to me in the document. But again, the entire notion here, Lively, bad actor, bad Hollywood actress. You should think of her as every negative stereotype you have of Hollywood actresses, Your Honor. Even if Lively had the contractual authority to approve her character's wardrobe, which she did not, a grant of such authority would not and could not imply the right to blow up the film's budget with additional unanticipated costs. In an effort to maintain harmony at the start of their working relationship and to avoid further delays caused by wardrobe conflicts, Baldoni and the studio reluctantly allowed Lively full control over her wardrobe. This concession quickly proved regrettable. And again, they're telling a story here that honestly doesn't look super positive about Baldoni and Wayfarer. That might well be, okay, she's a bad Hollywood actress, but essentially we enabled her, right? We tried to placate her, as was discussed earlier in this video when we were looking at comments. And in so doing, we only enabled more bad action as we went along, culminating in a California complaint, culminating in a libel lawsuit here, culminating in a federal lawsuit from Blake Lively herself. On the first day of principal photography, paparazzi captured and published photos of Lively in character wearing her self-selected wardrobe. These images were described as unflattering and sparked a backlash from the film's distributor, Sony. The film's distributor, Sony, was the backlash? Baldoni received direct criticism from Sony, who voiced concerns about the impact of the photos on the film's public perception. So not only is she engaged in this behavior, but what she is choosing to dress herself in had a direct negative implication on the film itself. Following these events, Baldoni approached Lively in her trailer to discuss necessary wardrobe adjustments. The conversation, while professional, took considerable time and was later grossly misrepresented in Lively's CRD complaint, falsely characterizing the exchange as a lengthy outburst that delayed filming and caused the crew to wait for hours while Baldoni cried in Lively's dressing room. This account, later published by The Times, is false. So at least we get back to the legal nut that we're trying to crack here, which is to say that what The Times published was false because they ignored all the rest of this historical context. Although Baldoni did briefly tear up during the conversation, it was in response to what he believed was a genuine compliment from Lively, praising his work as a director and actor. In hindsight, Baldoni recognized this as a manipulation tactic, likely intended to persuade him to continue allowing her unchecked control over wardrobe decisions. So Baldoni appears to be essentially accusing Blake Lively of a love bomb here, and worse, of characterizing this tearing up as crying. Now, I do have to admit, in a legal document, this sounds a lot like doth protesting too much. I wasn't crying. I was just tearing up. There was just some rain that fell under my eye. But again, they spin this around because this is a good bit of legal documenting to saying this was Lively manipulating him. Now, I don't know if that's fair either. Again, it's easy enough to see this as the other side of a PR war. So it's easy enough if we're going to say, okay, Lively was making claims that are difficult to corroborate because they're whispers in a dance scene, because they are videos that we hadn't seen before, that kind of thing. It's difficult to corroborate these things on the Baldoni side, to say what Lively did was a love bomb and she complimented him so that she could keep control of her wardrobe, and it was all manipulation and she's still a bad actor, Your Honor. Lively later leveraged this conversation in support of her allegations of harassment, alleging that Baldoni made inappropriate comments on her appearance. In reality, Baldoni was relaying the distributor's concerns and the widespread social media criticism regarding the wardrobe's failure to meet audience expectations, a sentiment Baldoni shared. This incident marked the beginning of a troubling pattern of manipulative behavior by Lively. Now, interestingly, you see how they framed this as Baldoni was acting just on behalf of Sony, and this was a result of Lively taking over wardrobe. But this, a sentiment Baldoni shared, belies what this conversation probably looked like in fact, which is to say Baldoni probably is having a conversation that Lively could take very negatively, in which he was probably not acting too terribly well in terms of a legal aspect of separating his sentiment from Sony's, probably combining them all as he says whatever he's saying to Lively, and Lively could take that very negatively. As a part of a sexual harassment complaint, that's probably a big deal. As part of just an interaction on the very difficult process of making a movie for hundreds of millions of dollars, it's probably not as big of a deal as presented. But either way, the description here is very much on Baldoni's side, is in Baldoni's favor. That's what you would expect from his representatives filing a lawsuit on his behalf. But we have to make note of that as we go through as well. So she seized the costuming. Now, Lively begins rewriting the script. During a red carpet interview at the New York City celebrity premiere of the film, Lively stated the iconic rooftop scene, "My husband actually wrote it. Nobody knows that but you now." This revelation came as a surprise to the film's credited screenwriter who, when later interviewed, graciously responded, "So if I'm being told that Ryan Reynolds, wrote that, then great. How wonderful." The screenwriter further acknowledged, "There were a few little flourishes that I did not write, and if those flourishes came from Ryan, I think that's wonderful." This was also the first time plaintiffs learned that Reynolds, who had no formal role in the film's production, made unauthorized changes to the script in secret. And this is part of where kind of the Hollywoodness of all of this comes in, which is to say there are very strict rules on what services you can perform on a movie, because the movies are made using what they call a guild system. It's a series of unions that provide services for any given movie production. And so there are questions about exactly what Ryan Reynolds contributed, exactly what the film's credited screenwriter, who is not named here, has to accept as part of additional screenwriting, because it is going to go under his name, right? It's going to be to his credit, and he's the one that has to defend it in the future. So they're very careful about these things, because movie making and all sorts of creative endeavors are very reputation based. So they describe this as graciously responded, at least as described in this paragraph. It is a gracious response. Okay, Ryan Reynolds wrote some of it. That's fine. Great. Wonderful. I'm glad it worked out so well, because he can't actually throw anybody under the bus there. And as we've talked about in part one, Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, power couple, very strong in Hollywood. Ryan Reynolds in particular on that score. And so if you are the film's credited screenwriter, if you are Wayfarer, Justin Baldoni, Jamie Heath, you are not wanting to upturn the apple cart. You are not wanting to offend these particular individuals as part of this. It's part of what makes the story and the power differential so interesting, is that Lively, even though she is, quote unquote, just the actress here, is in this power couple, does wield Ryan Reynolds in that early HR meeting that we saw described in the New York Times article and the complaint to California. And so there's a lot more going on here than it might initially appear, and a lot more power differential problems than just Baldoni down to Lively. Furthermore, Lively herself began altering the script daily. Now, I read that sentence and I say, okay, that's normal. I would imagine actors generally have notes and things that they have for their scripts on a regular basis if they're doing their jobs. I want them to be active participants in understanding their character and pursuing this movie-making endeavor. The frequency of Lively's revisions alarmed the producers, director, and studio, who anticipated that her interference would persist every day of the shoot and disrupt the production schedule. I can also imagine it going too far, certainly. Each shooting day was already intricately planned, and her constant changes introduced significant stress on the production crew and financial strain. However, just weeks prior, Lively's husband, Ryan Reynolds, had aggressively berated Baldoni during a meeting at their penthouse in New York, accusing him of fat shaming. Lively, Baldoni, in an effort to avoid confrontation with Lively and Reynolds and rebuild rapport with his co-star, continued to bend to her will. So again, they're telling a story. This is a Hollywood diva, and this wonderful gentleman, engaged in no sexual harassment, wanted to make a little movie about domestic violence, and is being pilloried by Lively and Reynolds together. Reynolds and Lively's inappropriate and humiliating berating of Baldoni, delivered perhaps intentionally as other celebrity friends were coming in and out of their penthouse, was prompted by Baldoni's reasonable inquiry into crucial information needed to ensure safety and avoid injury in a scene. Baldoni, while training for a physically demanding scene in which his character Ryle, I can't with these names, would lift Lily, asked his trainer, who was introduced to him by Lively and oversaw his training for the film, how much Lively weighed. Baldoni, who suffers from back issues, we saw the spine infection text earlier in this lawsuit, and has multiple bulging discs, made the inquiry to ensure he could safely perform the lift without injury. Ultimately, the trainer relayed this information to Lively, who then informed Reynolds. The confrontation that followed was so aggressive that Baldoni felt compelled to offer repeated apologies despite his question being entirely reasonable and made in good faith. He does seem to be the kind of person as described in this lawsuit that is quick to fall on his sword, right? And obviously, I'm not dealing with Hollywood actresses or Hollywood actors on a regular basis, but that might be part of the job of production and direction. Despite his question being entirely reasonable and made in good faith, following this incident, Lively refused to perform the lift scene, even though it had already been rehearsed with a stunt double. She refused to perform it, even though it had already been rehearsed. But why does she need to perform it if it's been rehearsed with a stunt double? I don't understand all of this paragraph, which isn't great for a lawsuit document, but that's okay. Certainly, as described here, the notion is Baldoni asked about weight in order to perform this particular stunt, and Lively goes back to her husband, and her husband comes in and yells at her boss. And that's bad enough in a normal circumstance. But when it's Ryan Reynolds that's the husband, it's triply bad. And so this story in and of itself paints Blake Lively in a very negative light. And again, this is part of a PR war, so we take all this with a grain of salt. But again, I think Baldoni and his representatives are doing a pretty good job, a pretty effective job of painting a picture entirely different from the universe in which the California complaint is describing. In fact, Lively threatened to quit the production altogether, despite her contractual obligations. Lively gave Baldoni an ultimatum to either cast someone else or work with her in the way she works. It was her way or the highway. Recasting would be detrimental to the production, sever Wayfarer's relationship with Sony, and cost millions. To highlight the effects of masterful gaslighting, Baldoni and Wayfarer also truly believed that in an effort to save herself from the backlash of being recast, Lively could leak that she felt fat-shamed by Baldoni, which he thought would ruin his career. Notably, it appears he was not wrong, and despite his efforts to do everything her way, she still tried, continues to try, and arguably did with the help of the Times, ruin his career, reputation, and well-being. This is the story of an actress who basically had always planned to do this through the New York Times. The New York Times was just their ever-willing participant in a libelous scheme, and so, court, we need your help because the New York Times deserves to be punished for this act. Beyond the script revisions, Lively extended her influence over the film to other areas, frequently challenging decisions and asserting control. She not only rewrote her own dialogue, but also made unilateral changes to other characters' lines, effectively altering the script on a broad scale. This pattern of interference continued to disrupt the production process, often causing stress, chaos, and delays. Over the months leading up to the film's release, Lively and her collaborators consistently scrutinized interactions with Baldoni and employed tactics that fall squarely within the definition of gaslighting. Again, not a legal term. Gaslighting, not a legal concept. You're allowed to lie to people in real life. You're allowed to tell someone that you're working late at the office when you really went somewhere else. You're allowed to do these things from a lawsuit perspective. But what this does is paint them as a bad actor. Gaslighting, one of the worst things you can do in the public eye right now, in social media land and otherwise. And so you use that term as a lawyer in a document like this to emphasize that this is a bad person that needs to be punished. Now, interestingly, Blake Lively not being sued right here. It's the New York Times, so it's kind of a couple of steps removed, but that's the idea. This behavior pressured Sony, Baldoni, and Wayfarer into ceding control to Lively at every turn, resulting in her domination of nearly every aspect of the film's production. And we kind of get the notion of what this entire story is, but we can continue a little bit. Lively sets the stage for coercion by drafting a protection letter that intentionally misrepresents the nature of the conversations had between Baldoni and or Heath and Lively, demands Wayfarer parties sign for Lively to return to work after the industry strikes. And this is where the complaint story, this is where the New York Times story starts. Principal photography began on May 15th, 2024. From mid-June to early November 2023, production was suspended due to the industry guild strikes. When the strikes ended on November 9th, 2023, production was eager to resume filming and make up for lost time. That same day, however, Wayfarer received an unsettling and unexpected email from Lively through her counsel containing a 17-point list of non-negotiable conditions that must be met before Lively would return to work. Interesting that that was written almost certainly before the strikes ended in order to issue it the same day. The Wayfarer disagreed as to the basis for requesting these conditions, which insinuated those demands were the result of inappropriate behavior by Baldoni and Heath. The terms were agreeable, and some were already in place. For example, Lively demanded that an intimacy coordinator be present at all times when Lively was on set. In fact, an intimacy coordinator had already been engaged during the first half of production, so Wayfarer took no issue with this request. Contrary to Lively's assertion, it was she who refused to meet with the intimacy coordinator to plan out scenes, putting Baldoni in the awkward position of meeting with the intimacy coordinator alone and later relaying sex scene suggestions to Lively in the intimacy coordinator's absence, not only defeating the purpose, but resulting in accusations by the Times that before shooting began, Baldoni wanted to add sex scenes that Lively considered gratuitous. In fact, these scenes were proposed by the intimacy coordinator. This is well documented in handwritten notes Baldoni took during meetings with the intimacy coordinator. Now, this is interesting. You don't usually give a recitation of evidence for these assertions. You don't see them in any other paragraphs, but this would suggest that they have a very strong belief that they can prove this particular point. And again, I think this is important as part of the story. This struck me as odd, even when I was reading the initial complaint. This is the kind of place where a curious person, I think, says, wait a minute, where did this list come from? And you say that this was a list of things, and you assert it in the complaint as things that both parties acknowledge are true. But all I really see is them signing onto a side letter that would cover these things, but I don't see the paragraph that I would see in a legal contract that says X agrees or represents and warrants that the following is accurate, right? I don't see that place where the other party actually agrees to these things. So it does appear like you're stealing a base. And the fact that you are stealing a base, at least as described in this paragraph, matches up with exactly how it looks to me when I looked at that complaint, suggests a certain amount of accuracy in this telling of the story versus the one that was in the California complaint. Now, again, that's just my kind of assessment looking at things because I had that question mark when I read through it initially. But it does appear to be a circumstance where you write up a letter of things that you don't want to have happen. You get the other side to agree that they won't happen on the implicit understanding that they did happen. You said that you don't want this to happen again, right? Is how those particular comments are written. And this is where you really should have a lawyer helping you out and saying, well, we don't want to agree to anything that kind of implies that we're acknowledging that those things occurred. So you have to add a sentence that says we are not acknowledging anything in a settlement document, which is a version of what this is. We've seen language in virtual legality and other places that I've talked about with you all that talks about neither side is admitting the liability, right? And I've said that's always kind of silly insofar as the settlement exists. One side or the other believes there's a chance that they would lose in a lawsuit. So there's a certain amount of liability. There's a certain amount of guilt or guilty action that is happening here. But for purposes of this document, nobody should read this document as us admitting to anything, right? And that's part of what has to go into this kind of process. And it doesn't look like they had full legal representation or someone cognizant of these particular potential problems in the context of this meeting. And this was the meeting, I believe, somebody in chat can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this was the meeting I believe that Ryan Reynolds was at as essentially Lively's representative. So it's already creating a weird power dynamic in the room. Here's another picture that is not really led into by that paragraph. Just hired intimacy coordinator, who I love, will set you up to meet with her next week for intro. Blake Lively says, I feel good. I can meet with her when I start. Thank you, though. Just FYI, just wanted to tell you about this. Seems she doesn't want to meet the intimacy coordinator until we start, which may mess up the workflow, but I can still meet with her, of course. Female producer says that's fine if she doesn't want to meet her now. You'll just have to walk her through what you are thinking. You and the intimacy coordinator are thinking. That's a weird edit. Like this is a edit of this text that replaces it with intimacy coordinator. Maybe that's a first name. Baldoni's dated handwritten notes from his meetings with the intimacy coordinator, which again, Lively declined attending, were read to Lively at her penthouse, where she insisted she and Baldoni meet to write sex scenes together. Again, I don't want to give legal advice to anyone. This is not a legal advice channel. This is for informational and educational purposes only. But as a general rule, outside of legal advice, you probably want to think twice about agreeing to meet with an employee in their penthouse to write sexual content of any kind, just as a general rule. It's just an easy way to get into trouble, I think. As it was, the sex scenes were not written, and it was always Baldoni's intention for them to be written with input from both the intimacy coordinator and Lively. The quote-unquote female gaze that Lively distorts in her CRD complaint, which the Times then publishes, in response to a proposal from the intimacy coordinator that Ryle not orgasm after he satisfied Lily, Lively remarked, I'd be mortified if that happened to me, to which Baldoni, following Lively's lead in what seemed like an attempt to connect and develop their characters, remarked that those have been some of the most beautiful moments with my wife and I. And again, we know that one of the complaints is don't talk about your sex life with me, to Baldoni and is characterized in this lawsuit, as we would expect from his team. Sounds pretty innocuous in the nature of building up a rapport and trying to make this movie together. From Lively's perspective, this was a bridge too far. It might be an entirely different context that she would claim this took place in. So I do want to just make sure everybody gives these documents with the same grain of salt we gave the initial complaint document. This is just one side asserting things. We expect Baldoni's side to make it as positive and genteel towards him as possible. It again distorts this, both in the protections for return to production she made Wayfarer, Heath, and Baldoni sign, and in the CRD complaint, which the Time publishes as fact without any investigation whatsoever. First, this suggestion did not originate with Baldoni, and Lively knew this. Second, it was Lively who first personalized the scenes. And third, and perhaps most importantly, they were writing scenes for their characters. Lively claims that Baldoni made her feel unsafe when he used the word sexy while discussing a wardrobe adjustment, when in fact, Lively herself had previously indicated both verbally and in a text message shown below that she wanted her character's wardrobe to be sexier. Now, again, this is an area where, again, I think the lawyers are doing a good job, but it's easy enough to imagine that just because I want my wardrobe to be sexier, even if I communicate that to you in text, there are still ways that you could come up to me, leer at me, and call me sexy, that it would be an unsafe work environment, that it would be a harassment type interaction, and that just the fact that I once said I wanted my wardrobe to be sexier does not necessarily mean that any and all instances of the use of the word sexy would be okay. Now, they're trying to tell a story that this instance is related to the earlier instance. That's fine. That's what you do in a lawsuit like this one. But I do want people to understand that some of what's happening here, which I've seen described on the internet and in social media as kind of silver bullets that devastate Blake Lively's case, etc., can be explained in ways that are more Lively focused, that are more on Lively's side of the equation. So this is the opposite of that complaint document, and we can look at it with the same critical eye. Baldoni, as the film's director, suggested she remove the coat, explaining that the look would be sexier without it. Lively took offense to the comment and appeared upset, interpreting it negatively rather than as creative direction. Feeling he had upset her, Baldoni apologized, despite having made a professional suggestion as a director. Notably, in a separate text exchange, Lively herself used the word sexy to describe one of the character's outfits while advocating for her own wardrobe choice, an inconsistency that undermines the basis of her complaint. And I think this is unfair, right? As a legal concept, and again, whether or not you use the word sexy is not a legal question so much. I think that this is a little bit unfair, right? If you use the word sexy, it doesn't mean you're okay with anybody anywhere saying sexy to you as a word in your place of employment. And we get into that same picture. Lively established what language is acceptable to her and what is not at the very outset of the relationship, just 2 days into filming. And this is part of the difficulty with human relationships or human resources, if you prefer corporate speak, or labor law, right? Is it human beings, not fully logical, not always rational. Lively appeared upset when he called her sexy. She might have legitimately been upset. Now, you can argue that running a movie like this, having employees, maybe you don't immediately fall on your sword and apologize for that because it creates more problems. And I would like to see more kind of legal advice being given to what seems to be a director that maybe is out of his depth a little bit with an actress that is demanding so much of him on a regular basis, at least as described in this lawsuit. But it's not completely out of bounds for someone to text something one day and feel its use in a different context to be upsetting, insulting, or harassing. To use this language herself then, in turn, make a note of each instance when her director used the same language, also to describe wardrobe and character, is at best a double standard. To generate a list of demands that insinuate he and his business partner acted inappropriately and refused to work unless they agreed not to do it again is calculating and even extortionistic. But to then use Wayfarer, Baldoni, and Heath's agreement to not do something they already did not do, were not doing and had no intention of doing, as the basis to file a non-public CRD complaint against them, and then release it to the public herself in order to ruin their reputations, is defamation. The Times was directly complicit in this. And again, this is Lively's defamation to the extent that this happened. And then, oh, by the way, yes, we understand the Times is the defendant here, so we're talking about them. I know we're talking a lot about Lively here, Your Honor, but this is really about the Times. That's the defendant in front of you, so we'll get back to that. And again, this is why they described Lively as diva-ish and the bad guy so much earlier in this complaint document, is so they can get to, all right, maybe it's just a double standard. Maybe Hoeg has a problem with it on his video show, but look at the series of steps that she needed to do to get to this point in time. And yes, if that's all premeditated, if that's all planned, that is calculating and honestly a kind of evil, in my opinion. But we don't really have enough to go on just with this complaint document. We wouldn't expect it at this moment in time. But this is good lawyering. This is Baldoni's team making Lively and her side look as bad as possible so that they can, in effect, make the Times look as bad as possible. Lively also established very early that it was acceptable to present while Lively was breastfeeding. Both Heath and Baldoni have children and are comfortable around breastfeeding mothers, and Lively seemed equally comfortable. In fact, Baldoni's wife co-founded a company that makes a breastfeeding garment, a prototype that originated with his mother when he was a baby. And as revealed in a text message exchange between Baldoni and Lively less than 2 weeks into filming, Lively invited Baldoni to her trailer to rehearse lines while she was pumping breast milk. Lively now alleges in the CRD complaint that Baldoni and or Heath would enter her makeup trailer of their own volition while she was breastfeeding. Notably, breastfeeding was an activity she often conducted openly in the presence of both Baldoni and Heath, including during production meetings. And yes, this goes to Lively as a liar, and she's lying in the complaint document, and the Times should have known about it. But like I said earlier, when this first came up in the introduction, the one invitation to come work on lines while pumping might indicate a certain comfort with it, and maybe that devalues the complaint document as is suggested in this lawsuit. But it is not a silver bullet. It is easy enough to imagine that, yes, she asked for something to be sexy once. She said, you can come into my trailer while I'm breastfeeding this one time, or pumping, as she says, in my trailer this one time. But that doesn't give you carte blanche to do it for the rest of the shoot or whatever it might be. It doesn't give you the ability to whisper sexy into my ear during a scene. There's any number of ways you can imagine this still working out with Lively having the better case as part of this. In the CRD complaint, published in part by the Times, Lively suggests Heath walked into her trailer unannounced while in state of undress and topless, which is false. Heath was invited into her trailer along with a female producer, Baldoni, and a Sony representative for a meeting requested by Lively. Mr. Heath arrived first to see if Lively was ready for the meeting, and after knocking and being invited in, saw that Lively was breastfeeding. She was not topless. She was having makeup removed from her collarbone while fully covered. That sentence is hard for me to parse. She's breastfeeding, but she's fully covered. So baby's under a blanket or something. Heath asked if she should return at a later time. Lively said no. They could move forward with the meeting as initially planned and would meet them after she finished removing makeup. Roughly 2 weeks later, Lively announced that she thought she had seen Heath make eye contact with her. Heath immediately apologized and said he hadn't even realized he looked her way, in response to which Lively remarked, "I know you weren't trying to cop a look." A reference to this incident conveniently showed up on a document months later, distorted like the others and out of context, in a list the Times later published as fact. By the time Wayfarer received the protections for return to production document, Wayfarer had invested millions of dollars, completed half the film with Lively as lead, and incurred substantial costs in preparation to resume production immediately following the strikes. So she knew she was in a position of leverage. However, instead of returning to work as anticipated, they received Lively's list of demands. In the spirit of ensuring Lively felt comfortable on set, Wayfarer promptly agreed to her terms despite disagreeing with the insinuations underlying them. Neither Wayfarer, Heath, nor Baldoni had engaged in any of the behavior alluded to in the return to production document, nor did they plan to. And again, this is an area where, as a lawyer, I just don't understand why that side letter doesn't have some kind of disclaiming notion that says we are not acknowledging the accuracy of your complaints in the previous email or the 17-point list that led to that side letter. They thought that was the end of it, and they were ready to move ahead and make a great film. I especially don't understand it, even if you're somewhat naive and you don't think you need to lawyer up for these kinds of things. If you are in the process of this story that you're telling in your lawsuit, if you are saying that Blake Lively has been a problem this whole time, then you expect this to be a certain kind of trap. You expect this to be another move on her part. So this rings a little false to me, if only because it doesn't strike me as a place where they would be unlikely to lawyer up, to have the defenses they would need for purposes of this documentation. But maybe I'm giving them too much credit, and maybe they were just trying to get to the end of the day, right? I will say that Baldoni does appear to be someone that likes to avoid conflict. It was agreed that filming would resume on January 5th, 2024. On the evening of January 4th, 2024, Baldoni, Heath, and producers Todd Black and Alex Sachs, a representative of Sony, and the film's first AD were invited to Lively and Reynolds' penthouse in New York City. Stop meeting in their New York City penthouse. They arrived eager to discuss plans for the next day's filming, prepared with their production materials. Instead, they were blindsided by Lively and Reynolds, who presented a list of grievances that were both unanticipated and troubling. Reynolds launched into a tirade, berating Baldoni in what Baldoni later described as a traumatic encounter, stating he had never been spoken to like that in his life. Reynolds demanded an apology to Lively for actions that were mischaracterized and demonstrably false. See below. When Baldoni resisted apologizing for what he had not done, this is the first time we've seen him resist apologizing, Reynolds became further enraged. Everyone, including the producer, Lively had asked production to engage, and a representative of Sony that was in attendance left that meeting in shock. The producer offered that in his 40-year career, he had never seen anyone speak to someone like that in a meeting. The Sony representative mentioned that she would often think of that meeting, and her one regret is that she didn't stop Reynolds berating Baldoni. That's all very interesting to me, if only because having been in very tense situations with people that are not so genteel and are very demonstrative and vocal in their upsettedness at a specific situation, I have heard some stuff. And I imagine that acting in Hollywood, running movies, producing movies, being at Sony, being in these major companies that help finance and produce movies, you would have heard some stuff too. So if this is accurate, that tirade must have been really something else. And again, my tilt is against Ryan Reynolds, so take of that what you will. On the very first page of her CRD complaint, Lively inaccurately claims that a list of 30 items was agreed upon during this meeting. This assertion is categorically false. The 30-point list is strategically positioned to appear as if it were a standalone written document. I noted this when I looked at the complaint in part 1. However, no such document was ever presented to Baldoni, the Wayfarer team, or, to their knowledge, anyone else until the state of California, whether during that meeting or at any other time, and therefore could not have been agreed to. In reality, many of these items were encountered for the first time in the CRD complaint itself and include references to highly disturbing events that never occurred. The repeated use of the phrase "no more" before each demand falsely suggests that these alleged incidents had previously taken place and needed to cease. This implication is not only misleading, but entirely untrue. So this at least gives some understanding of why you might not have had additional disclaimer language. You didn't really know from the 17-point letter that this letter, the one that was used at the front of the complaint, was in the offing somewhere. I still would have defended my client or asked to defend my client against the notion that even the 17 points were accurate at the time. If I felt I was being trapped like this, if I had just been emotionally berated by Ryan Reynolds in his New York City penthouse apartment. But, you know, it's easy enough. Hindsight is 20/20 to look at this in reverse and say I would have done those things. Baldoni and Heath left the meeting deeply unsettled by the implications of Lively and Reynolds' behavior and the power dynamics at play. Faced with mounting pressure and weighing the financial implications of what shutting down a film halfway through production would mean, Wayfarer made the difficult decision to resume production and finish the film, despite fears that Lively was intentionally manipulating facts for her own gain. The stakes were extraordinarily high. Financiers had invested substantial resources, hundreds of cast and crew members had endured months without work due to the strikes, and nearly 5 years of development had gone into bringing this film to life. Filming resumed without further grievances or references to prior disputes from Lively, a fact that Lively concedes in her CRD complaint. However, the lasting effects of Lively's allegations left Baldoni uneasy. He and Wayfarer continued to make considerable concessions throughout production, all in the interest of successfully delivering an outstanding film. And again, Your Honor, our clients just wanted to make a movie. Lively takes over editing, fires the film's editor and composer, and creates her own version of the film at Wayfarer's expense, while the rightful director continues to edit his cut of the film. Paragraph 80. The Directors Guild of America mandates a 10-week protected period during which the director of a feature film is entitled to privately edit the film and assemble the director's cut. This period is considered sacred, providing the director with uninterrupted time to creatively shape the final product, an opportunity to experiment, take risks, and refine until the film fully reflects their artistic vision. For Baldoni, this period represents the pinnacle of the filmmaking process, a time to immerse himself in the creative craft, free from external influences. Unfortunately, he was denied this essential experience. Yes, this is where you hear some directors talk about finding the movie, finding it in the edit, and having that period of time to go do that. Lively requested to join Baldoni in the editing bay. As a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in the entertainment industry, and having grown up in a family deeply involved in the field, Lively was fully aware of the implications of her request. And note here, just like we mentioned as part of the complaint in the earlier part of this series, that they are using certain language to give you implications about someone, right? So Lively, super important in the field. Again, addressing that power dynamic concept, right? Baldoni is being asked by someone who's a seasoned professional, a famous person with a famous family, with resources, married to another famous person, and she knew darn well what she was asking for. In fact, her request explicitly acknowledged that it infringed upon Baldoni's protected period. Nonetheless, in the aftermath of the serious false allegations she had leveled against the production, Baldoni, Wayfarer, and Sony reluctantly agreed to grant her access to the editing bay for 2 days. Notably, despite her allegations that Baldoni made her uncomfortable, Lively sought to spend prolonged close time with him in the confined and collaborative space of the editing bay. And I think, again, this is good lawyering, but I am uncomfortable with it myself, which is to say this is kind of the standard operating procedure of dismissing or discounting sexual harassment kind of complaints, right? Would this person really spend time with this other person? Doesn't that mean that they were lying in the first instance? And I'm not comfortable with that as a logical throughway. I don't think that she had to be lying about everything else. I think there are reasons to believe that maybe some of that is hyperbolized and maybe is in fact lies based on other context. But just the fact that she wanted to spend time in the editing bay with him, I don't think leads you to that space. What began as a 2-day collaboration extended into 10 days, during which Lively sought to work alone in the editing bay without Baldoni. Despite Baldoni incorporating 7 pages of her notes into his own edit at the very onset and consistently keeping her involved in every subsequent edit, Lively expressed dissatisfaction with mere collaboration, asserting that she too deserved the opportunity to see her creative vision realized. And again, if this is as presented, this is the kind of thing where you say, okay, well, you didn't pay to have the movie made. You didn't pay for the licensing rights. You are just the actor on this. And I can understand wanting to have more creative control, but this isn't your money on the line. This isn't your risk. And at this point in time, we can assume that the story ends with Baldoni capitulating in some respects. But I do think that his behavior here is enabling of some bad acts, if the story is as described. She requested exclusive time with the editors. In response, Wayfarer flew Baldoni's editor to New York to assist Lively in the process, presumably at her New York penthouse apartment. Eventually, Lively fired the film's editors, replacing them with her own choice, specifically an editor often used by Reynolds. She also fired the film's award-winning composer, replacing him with composers from Reynolds' recent project. I can't even imagine who that might be. I don't know any of the composers on Reynolds movies. She also fired the film's... let's not repeat that. Against repeated objections, Lively created her own cut of the film at Wayfarer and Sony's expense. It's Sony's expense too now. Sony later informed Wayfarer that Lively would not promote the film unless her demands were met. And again, as described, this is the story of an actress seizing control. Believing that Lively's edits would simply supplement Baldoni's work, Baldoni continued refining his director's cut. However, faced with the possibility of Lively refusing to promote the film or approve any related marketing material, a scenario that would have had catastrophic implications, Wayfarer and Baldoni felt compelled to acquiesce. This included funding a friends and family screening of a version of the film they had not approved or even seen, entirely at Lively's insistence. Having already invested millions of dollars along with years of time, energy, and personal sacrifice, Wayfarer and Baldoni were left with no viable alternatives. I will say this, right? I'm trying to be as objective as possible and talk you through the various areas in which I see certain holes in this particular story. This is a very effective storytelling in this lawsuit. I feel saddened by what at least the character of Justin Baldoni, as described in this story in this lawsuit, is going through. And so it's very effective lawyering in my eyes. Wayfarer and Sony found themselves in an unprecedented and uncomfortable predicament. 2 competing versions of the film, created by 2 different individuals, one of whom had no contractual or creative right to edit the film, let alone produce their own cut. In fact, in this particular set of circumstances, I believe Baldoni has the ability to go through his guild, to go through the director's circuit, and go and make sure that his cut wins the day, or make sure that his name gets removed from the film, or various other ways that you can go and protect yourself as a director and a creative in the film industry. Faced with Lively's threat to withhold promotion of the film, the studio reluctantly agreed to do an official audience test of both versions. Lively's cut, Baldoni's director's cut, once again at Wayfarer's Sony's expense. This decision was made with the understanding that Lively had agreed with Sony that if Baldoni's director's cut tested higher, she would drop the matter and fully cooperate, and Baldoni could proceed finishing the film without Lively's editorial interferences. Now, if this is the case, you get this in writing, folks. Lawyer up at some point here, guys. Unsurprisingly, despite Baldoni's cut scoring significantly higher with audiences and the film's target demographic, Lively reneged on her promise. Now, we don't actually have evidence of a promise here. We have his understanding of a promise, but fair enough. I'll let you steal that base. She insisted that her cut be the version released to the public, even going so far as to claim that the author of the book would also refuse to promote the film if Lively's version were not chosen. That demands the subjunctive. Sorry, lawyers. Under immense pressure, Sony and Wayfarer once again conceded. Lively demands a producer credit and an undeserved PGA mark. Under the continued threat that in spite of her contractual obligation, Lively would not promote the film or approve marketing materials, Wayfarer agreed at Sony's behest to give Lively a producer credit, but her commands did not stop there. Lively later sought the coveted PGA mark on her producer credit, a certified designation licensed by the Producers Guild of America to identify producers who have performed the majority of the producing functions on a motion picture, aka the real producer. Neither Baldoni nor Wayfarer felt Lively fulfilled the requisite criteria to earn this mark. Lively demanded that Baldoni, Heath, and other producers and department heads send letters to the BGA in support of her certification for the PGA mark. Despite unanimous recognition of the absurdity and the upsetting nature of what appeared to be an attempt at coercion, Sony and other parties ultimately acquiesced and submitted letters of support. One thing that this story says, if it's true, is that actors can be real holy terrors on a production once the money is invested, right? Once there's leverage in their not promoting a movie, in them actively saying that the movie is bad or what have you, then they can cause all sorts of trouble. And understand that Sony has dealt with defecting actors in the past, right? I mean, famously, if you don't know, the Madam Web movie, the lead actor in that, and I forget her name, I apologize, I think it's Dakota something, Johnson maybe, went out there and said, basically, this movie is crap, without going quite so far in order to, one presumes, comply with their contractual obligations. But it's clear that Sony has had issues with actors defecting before, and an actor of Blake Lively's stature, with apparently a very angry Ryan Reynolds in the back, might be willing to acquiesce on these grounds. Although, again, Wayfarer has some excuse insofar as they're a small studio producing a film of this nature, I think, for the first time. Baldoni is clearly more willing to give apologies than he probably should be. Sony shouldn't. You need somewhere where the buck stops. The distributor financing part of this needs to take control of the situation in some respects. Like, if this all happened as described, this was bad at all levels. Lively taking over, Baldoni acquiescing, Sony not being a backstop. There are numerous failure points for how this happens because it never should happen this way. However, because Lively did not perform the duties of a producer, and therefore, in the professional opinion of the studios, did not qualify for the PGA mark, a distinction highly valued and taken seriously within the industry, Wayfarer and Baldoni refused to misrepresent her contributions to the film. Despite having conceded on nearly every other demand at this point, they believed it unjust and unethical to falsely represent to the PGA that she had fulfilled the requisite producing responsibilities. Lively, in turn, instructed Sony to tell Wayfarer and Baldoni that any goodwill left between us is done. Eventually, in the face of persistent threats levied against Wayfarer and Baldoni, they were left with little choice but to draft and sign a letter on Lively's behalf. Upon doing so, Heath provided a copy of the letter to Wayfarer's lawyers, lawyer up, accompanied by a statement indicating that they signed the letter under duress. Lively proceeded to make good on her threat. Lively's successful bullying tactics result in Baldoni's exile from his own film. So we'll talk about this in just a second as well. I see a lot of comments coming in, and I do want to take a minute for my voice here. HP says, if this happened as described, everyone was incompetent at their jobs, and I'd reconsider using them on future projects, right? I mean, one aspect of this lawsuit is that everybody feels like they're at least one level above where they should be in doing the job that they've been tasked with doing, including the Sony representative. And so it is a choice by Justin Baldoni and his team to put a story out here like this, yes, to act against the sexual harassment complaint, to act against the smear campaign complaint, but also to put into question Wayfarer and his abilities to actually run a motion picture. Now, money matters more, and we know that it ends with us made money, so maybe that's all okay, but it does suggest to me that I would be reluctant to put my money behind this particular crew of people making a film if they are going to be so easily taken hostage by a defecting actor. Carrie Harvey says, agreed with HP. Their inability to control all these shenanigans looks so unprofessional all around. Her bullying and his allowing it equals both really unprofessional. And I'm sympathetic to the position. I understand wanting to avoid conflict. I'm obviously not in a profession where that's really a tenable solution to all things. We have a lot of conflict points here, but I am a transactional attorney, so I do like to get deals done, find ways for us to move forward on things. But sometimes that demands a certain uncomfortable conversation, right? I talk to my clients about this all the time when we're forming companies, right? You've got 2 founders, you got 3 founders, how many founders you have? They're all friends. They have this great idea. They want to go into business together. And I say, okay, what if you disagree? We have to figure out what a deadlock gets solved by, a deadlock. And so if you have a vote that's deadlocked against each other, how are we going to solve that? What does it look like if we exit? How does distributions work? Where does the money go? And a lot of the times that's uncomfortable for people. Much like a prenuptial agreement, you don't want to think about what does this look like in a conflict situation? What does this look like if it falls apart? who has the obligations if we go bankrupt, that kind of thing. But it is so much easier, it's so much more effective to have that conversation on the front end than it is in the crisis moment, right? You need to establish those guidelines. You need to establish expectations. You need to control your actors. And if this is the story that you're going out with, you failed to do that throughout the entire filming of your movie. And Sony should be ashamed. Wayfair should be in some respects. Baldoni should be ashamed. And that's even before you get into all the accusations that Lively makes in her California complaint. So I think that this is a bad look for this company as professionals making a movie, but they do have a $350 million picture under their belts. So that might ease a lot of concerns in the long run. Renata says the same. First big movie, and this studio is being sued by the actress, by their own publicist, and is going from one of the biggest newspapers on the planet. I'd stay away from them too. Yes, that's another aspect of this story, Renata. I'm glad you brought it up. This has proven to be a case where this company and its founders are more than willing to be litigious, and in circumstances which are unlikely to bear fruit for them, as we just talked about, based on the anti-SLAPP statute in California, based on the nature of this particular case against the New York Times, who probably has a justified reason to believe in the truth value of the allegations in the California complaint and doesn't necessarily have to dive deep into whether or not they are fully true. They might do better to have more alleged in their article, but probably not defamatory on its face. And you sue them anyway for strategic reasons. That is the kind of thing that you might want to avoid if you are otherwise conflict averse, as so many investors are, just like Justin Baldoni, seemingly. The Queen Remembers does add, and I would be highly reluctant to hire Blake for her strong-arming threats and hostile behavior. I think that there is a certain notion out there that you can see on social media and articles and otherwise that Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, especially as a combo, but even separately, have a certain history of at least being demanding presences on films. If we don't want to say coercive or threatening, that kind of thing, they're very least high demand individuals on these movies. And yeah, that's great as long as you can bring in the bucks. And it does appear that Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively can bring in the bucks. So that's going to solve a lot of problems for him. But I would also be reluctant, especially if I'm using producers or directors that are relatively new to the game. Carrie says, I wouldn't want to do business with any of them after this. I can understand that. I think being in the movie making business, the motion picture industry is rough and tumble as it is. But I don't know that I fully had a grasp on how much leverage and how much trouble an actor that chose to be could be to a film, as at least as it's described in this lawsuit. Right? Once that money's invested, if promotion is that important to actually making money off the movie, then there's a lot of leverage even after filming. And this is a case that, at least as described here, would suggest that as well. HP says, if you're conflict averse, you can't be in a leadership management position because it will lead to bad situations like this. I agree. I would tell my clients that. You have to have the conversation. I would say this for parents as well. Some of the worst things that can happen with anybody that you're trying to guide forward in life, whether that's as an employee or a child, is that you essentially enable them, you let things go until they get beyond the place where it's comfortable to have them be that way. And it's important to have the uncomfortable conversation. It's important to have the conflict point, even if you aren't actively fighting, even if it's uncomfortable, because you can help to avoid these things before they happen. All right. So let's proceed with paragraph 92. Lively's successful bullying tactics result in Baldoni's exile. Consistent with her pattern of vindictiveness, as the premiere of the film approached, Lively instructed Sony that she and the cast would not participate in any marketing or promotion of the film alongside Baldoni. This is part of that enabling conversation, right? Her threat was that she wouldn't help promote the film unless he did X, Y, and Z. He did X, Y, and Z, and now she threatens not to promote the film, at least as described again in this lawsuit. And that's kind of the aspect of you don't negotiate with terrorists, right? They can always ask for another thing. For whatever reason, you tried to appease me. I'm not happy with that appeasement, and I'm going to do what I said I was going to do anyway. Because you don't have a realistic way of stopping me from doing that. And you've also indicated that you're weak on this. She made certain that Baldoni was removed from all artwork for the film, posters included, and stripped him of a film buy credit. Furthermore, Lively and Reynolds unfollowed him on social media, as did the author of the book. someone with whom Baldoni had maintained a 5-year personal relationship and for whom Baldoni created this opportunity, and other cast members creating the false impression that Baldoni had done something wrong. Here's another area where I don't understand the lack of lawyering here. This is a known quantity in movie making. I would assume that most studios, most PR firms, however you're going to organize the way you structure these contracts for making a movie, would have some provision that says you're not going to change your following status of anybody associated with this movie in the promotional period for the film, and maybe while it's also out in theaters. Because all of this can create a hullabaloo, can give you this leverage, can concede this power to these people for nothing more than clicking a like or unlike button on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or wherever. And you don't want to give that leverage up. It's very easy to have a legal obligation to say you're not going to change your status during the filming of the movie. And yes, that might feel like you are requiring somebody to show publicly as friends in a deceptive way, but it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be you will be friends. So you won't hit the buttons to change things. You won't raise these issues. If these are going to be story generators for TMZ, the New York Times, or anywhere in between, then we, as the investors in a multi-million-dollar project, can't afford to have the whims of a heart on a social media app lose us hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is another area where I think you just have to lawyer up a little bit more. And all of this indicates to me that they weren't tying up the loose ends as well as they should be and got themselves way out on their skis in a situation where they just were incapable of dealing with a problem child in this particular capacity. It became clear that Lively was working diligently to contrive a narrative that would explain why she took over the film and exiled Baldoni. Baldoni had no intention of ever making this information public, ever. He promoted the film as originally intended, gave Lively full credit and praise, and wanted the film to succeed. He wanted to move on. Lively, however, refused to let it go. So the story here is that Blake Lively is now concerned that it will reflect negatively on her if folks find out that she seized control of the film. So the sexual harassment campaign, the complaint to California, all of this, the New York Times article, everything before she winds up suing because she's forced to by this lawsuit against the New York Times, or at least that's the way that story goes. Everything before that is essentially a concerted effort to help people understand, at least in her view, why she needed to take control of this movie because Baldoni is such a bad actor. But again, PR war, right? Because that's exactly what Baldoni is saying about Lively here. Baldoni later received word that during the premiere of his movie Deadpool and Wolverine, Reynolds approached Baldoni's agent at William Morris Endeavor and demanded that the agent drop Baldoni. Now that's a confusing characteristic of this particular issue, because you would think that in a lawsuit against the Times, you would want it clear that the Times article resulted in the dropping of Baldoni's agent. But this confuses that issue. It does make Lively and Reynolds look worse, but it does limit the damages that the Times might have on their side of things, and you need to show damages in anything that's not negligence per se. The wielding of power and influence became undeniable. Baldoni and Wayfarer grew increasingly fearful of what Lively and Reynolds were capable of, as their actions seemed aimed at destroying Baldoni's career and personal life. Lively systematically excluded Baldoni from all marketing and promotional efforts with her and the cast for the film. He was not invited to any cast promotional events, cast screenings, premieres, photo shoots, or other cast campaigns. Baldoni was marginalized from the marketing process and left in the dark about the purported marketing plan allegedly created by Lively and Sony, which was later referenced in Lively's CRD complaint as agreed to by all. Yes, and even in the complaint, it seemed obvious that you'd have a signed document if that were in fact the case. It's just an assertion, and now it's an assertion that is being contravened. While in Sweden celebrating his wife's birthday, Baldoni was informed that Lively demanded he not attend the film's premiere on August 9th, 2024. Lively further threatened that if Baldoni attended the premiere, she and the majority of the cast would boycott. It remained unclear what Lively had communicated to or promised the cast, but they now also refused to attend if Baldoni was present. The fact that Sony advised Wayfarer to concede underscores Lively and Reynolds' immense power and influence. Yeah, or from the other side, right, from the complaint side of the documents, this would be the cast agreed with Lively that there was a sexual harassment campaign, that there were perverts on set, and it was Baldoni and Heath, and they don't want to appear with him. And they told Sony that, and Sony agreed that Baldoni should not be involved, right? So two sides of this coin. I do think Baldoni and his team have put together a impressive picture of an alternative set of events to what's in that complaint, but the complaint does tell a different story. Baldoni and Wayfarer refused to succumb to the bullying tactics aimed at preventing them from attending the premiere of the film, a project they had financed, produced, and owned. This threat marked the culmination of a year-long campaign of intimidation and harassment. Although objectively egregious and shocking, the Wayfarer team had unfortunately grown accustomed to the bullying, fully aware of the immense power this couple wielded and the far-reaching extent of their influence. However, they refused to concede to this demand. Now, interestingly, I added when I read it, if you were listening. The threat marked the culmination of a year-long campaign, but this just says year-long campaign. That suggests to me that this probably once said years-long campaign where you wouldn't need the Article A there, and they walked it back. Unclear exactly why that would be. It does appear that based on what's in this document, they would say that the campaign began really when Lively started shooting, but maybe they wanted to shorten it really only to the seizure of the film. Just days before the film's premiere, Baldoni was still unsure if he would even be allowed to attend. His friends and family, many traveling from outside New York, were left in limbo, unable to finalize travel plans or book flights. Finally, through Sony, Wayfarer persuaded Lively to permit Baldoni and the Wayfarer team, along with their friends and family, to attend, though only under demeaning and humiliating conditions. They were relegated to a separate theater to view the film, required to arrive at a different time than the rest of the cast, and instructed to leave the venue immediately after Lively arrived. Baldoni was also excluded from the official celebrity after party, despite it being an event paid for by Wayfarer. As a result, Baldoni had to quickly organize and personally fund a separate after party for himself and the Wayfarer team, forcing the company to cover the costs for two events, one for Lively and one for their own friends, family, crew, and team. Now, forced is a strong word there. You don't actually have to have a second party, but it does seem like you'd want to have a party for actually producing a movie at your movie production studio. Upon arrival, Baldoni began participating in red carpet photos and interviews. However, his efforts were abruptly cut short when it was conveyed that Lively was on her way, and he was instructed to stop immediately. He and his family were quickly ushered away. Security personnel, acting as though there was a risk of escape, escorted Baldoni's group to the basement of the building. There they were confined to a makeshift area surrounded by concession stand stock, with only fold-out tables and chairs arranged in a square. It is interesting to imagine the picture here of a multi-million-dollar red carpet movie premiere, and the actual production studio and friends and family are in what amounts to a church basement with popcorn bags and fold-out tables where they're watching this movie premiere, presumably. Surrounded by close friends, family, soda bottles, and a lot of love, the irony of being held in a basement on what was arguably one of the most important nights of Baldoni's career thus far was not lost on anyone. Once the main theater was deemed clear of Lively and her guests, Baldoni and his group were ushered into a separate theater to view the film. At the conclusion of the screening, they were again quickly escorted by security out of the building to avoid even a chance of interaction with Lively and her guests. The Wayfarer after party, held separately from the celebrity event, was a dry gathering, reflecting the values and themes that Wayfarer stands for. It's an interesting inclusion. It was attended by the entire Wayfarer team from Los Angeles and their friends and family. The atmosphere and tone of the Wayfarer after party were aligned with Baldoni's vision for the film, focusing on celebration and gratitude. Again, Baldoni, good guy. He's against drink. He's against everything you're against, Your Honor. He's for everything you're for. In the meantime, Baldoni was sidelined as Lively and Sony pressed forward with his original promotional strategy for the film. This plan, outlined in his initial proposal to Sony years prior, shared with Lively, and communicated numerous times to both Sony and Lively, centered on a partnership with the organization No More. Founded in 2013, No More is a global initiative aimed at raising awareness, inspiring action, and sparking conversations to end domestic violence and sexual assault. I don't know this group from Adam, but it sounds like a good group. Baldoni's collaboration with the organization began in 2022 and held deep personal significance. Staying true to his purpose for undertaking the film, Baldoni prioritized amplifying the voices of survivors of domestic violence. His efforts reflected the heart of the film's story and its profound impact on audiences. He returned to the core reason for embarking on the project in the first place, his initial outreach to the author of It Ends With Us 5 years earlier. Focusing on the film's message and its potential to create positive change, Baldoni poured himself into ensuring its success despite the mounting challenges. These genuine efforts aimed at amplifying the voices of survivors impacted by the film were later mischaracterized and weaponized against Baldoni. The Times, failing to do its due diligence before publishing the article, describes these genuine efforts to bring attention to a serious issue as part of a calculated campaign to destroy Lively's reputation, and in doing so, participated in destroying plaintiffs' lives. Again, they try to bring it back to the Times, but you can feel the kind of half-hearted nature of this. The lawsuit is really against Lively. Lively's the bad actor. Reynolds, to some extent, also the bad actor. But we'll bring in the Times because they're the ones that are actually being sued here, and that's important for a lawsuit type document. But it does seem to be a little bit hand-waving. But yeah, this story is awful, right? If this is true, and there's no reason to believe really the facts here are not true. This is easy enough to disprove if they weren't true, that he was shunted off into a kind of church basement for his own premiere and had to have a separate party in which he funded both in order to appease Blake Lively and her guests. Like that's a tough story. Does that have anything to do with defamation? Not really. But it's designed to tell you that Blake Lively is a bad person, Ryan Reynolds is a bad person, and the Times, for just believing Blake Lively without doing any more research, as is required for journalists, also bad people. Doesn't make them illegal people, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Baldoni forced to hire crisis public relations to combat Lively's negative press push, and here's the explanation, right? The New York Times says you did this in order to destroy Blake Lively, and you are saying that this was all in defense. Blake Lively had engaged in this year-long campaign, and you hired Nathan in order to have some kind of counterbalance, counterpunch to what Blake Lively and her team were doing. We'll get more of those pictures from the text messages. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because I am running out of voice. In the article, the Times writes, Lively's filing includes excerpts from thousands of pages of text messages and emails that she obtained through a subpoena. These and other documents were reviewed by the New York Times. However, the Times failed to review and or investigate the plethora of communications demonstrating that plaintiffs had zero intention of smearing Lively and every intention of simply promoting the film and its message. And again, I think we went over this in the introduction, but this is the kind of crux of their complaint here, that there was a whole host of text messages that either reverse what the New York Times reported or gave additional context and information as to what the New York Times and the complaint wound up going out with. But again, from a legal perspective, I'm really not sure that the New York Times actually has the obligations that Justin Baldoni and his team suggest that they have here, which is to say, once they have the complaint document, they should be using the word alleged in what they're reporting, but they can report on the existence of the complaint itself. They don't really have to dive too deeply as to what's happening there unless they have reason to believe that it's false. Worse still, there are documented communications overlooked by Lively and the Times that expressly refute Lively's erroneous accusations. By way of example, these get a little small here. This is the pumping in my trailer text. Though the Times admits that it had access to thousands of relevant text messages and emails, I might have used the word claims there. They do admit it. That's fair, but I don't know that they actually did. Its skewed reporting makes painfully obvious that it failed to substantiate the false accusations hurled by Lively. In fact, it's very difficult to substantiate false accusations. Indeed, the objective evidence refutes any allegation that plaintiffs engaged in a smear campaign to bury Lively and destroy her reputation. Lively's wound was entirely self-inflicted. That plaintiffs retained crisis public relations to defend against Lively's unrelenting assault does not change this fact. Then we get to Stephanie Jones. Told you we'd come back to her. Curiously, neither Lively's CRD complaint nor the article make any mention of embattled publicist Stephanie Jones. Jones, former publicist to Wayfarer, now insists, as part of a separate lawsuit filed in New York, that she was swept up in plaintiff's so-called smear campaign. And yet on August 14th, 2024, Jones sent an email to Heath detailing her recommended strategy of flooding the zone with positives. We need to ensure that we promote positive narratives that media outlets cannot ignore and prepare alternate stories. We should mobilize a robust network of supporters and third-party advocates ready to counter these narratives on deep background. Wayfarer later terminated Jones for, among other things, having allegedly leaked information to the Daily Mail, despite specific instruction from Wayfarer not to. So Wayfarer, on the whole, has a whole lot of difficulty in keeping its employees doing what they should be doing, or at least doing what it wants them to be doing, which is an employer's right. Jones is notorious for exacting her revenge on any client brave enough to escape her grasp. Seems like an interesting hire for Wayfarer in the first instance, if that sentence is true. Jones is equally notorious for her alleged maltreatment of current and former employees alike. Wayfarer and Able are no exception. It is hardly coincidence that all of the communications on which Lively and the teams now rely were purportedly produced by Jones's company, JonesWorks, LLC, pursuant to subpoena. The propriety of this alleged subpoena is unverified. Nobody has any idea what the subpoena was for, and at minimum, highly questionable given Jones's involvement and the means by which Jones first obtained these confidential communications, right? As we said in part one, the availability of even the text messages appearing in the complaint was odd. And the New York Times said it was pursuant to subpoena. Nobody appears interested enough to describe exactly what the subpoena was about. Here, it is at least suggested that it was highly questionable because of the nature of Jones's separation from Wayfarer. Abel, a former employee of JonesWorks, was forced to relinquish her electronic devices when confronted by a JonesWorks security guard and attorney upon her separation from the company. 6 weeks after she had put in notice and shared her plan to start her own business, Jones, on the heel of a damning Business Insider article and hemorrhaging clients, insisted that Abel turn over her electronic devices to allow JonesWorks to delete all confidential and proprietary information therefrom. I get that this is being shown here to sound nefarious. That's pretty standard operating procedure for an employee that's leaving employment and the electronics that is being used for work purposes in that capacity. I can tell you from personal experience that most companies will have some kind of procedure document that talks about handing over electronics. Even if they're your own, you can get them back after they've been scrubbed of company information. 4 months later, Abel's text messages are now the subject of Lively's CRD complaint and the article. Plaintiffs are informed and believe, so they don't have good evidence here, but they have reason to believe that Jones invited the subject subpoena to circumvent her confidentiality obligations to Wayfarer and to inflict the most unethical form of revenge. So, this is a person that was employed by Wayfarer, leaves, and then they are suggesting that they encouraged a legal process, a subpoena, because they otherwise have a confidentiality obligation to not share the information that they had obtained from working at Wayfarer, and essentially was working with Lively's team to get this information made available in the complaint and then ultimately to the New York Times. I mean, there's a whole host of different interactions here, all of which reflect poorly on Wayfarer, many of which reflect poorly on Blake Lively and her side of things. Very few of which so far reflect incredibly poorly on the New York Times, which is another part of the reason why I think this lawsuit is going nowhere. The New York Times is one of the most widely read newspapers in the United States. So we've got some paragraphs here talking about the New York Times being awesome. For generations, the paper's historical influence on the socio-political and cultural life of the country and its institutions could not be overstated. Americans long relied on the Times as a source of accurate and balanced news reporting. Viewpoint-based commentary was expressly excluded from news stories. Now, I think we know in Hangouts and Headlines that is not really the case in New York Times articles so much. I like the New York Times for a lot of the stuff they report on. They aren't great at separating editorialization from their news. Indeed, for years, Americans grew to expect that the Times would, as legendary Times executive editor A.M. Rosenthal said, tell it straight, or in other words, simply report the news without embellishing or driving it. For much of its storied history, whether it was the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, Watergate, or other political and cultural issues, through its objective investigative reporting and the diverse views represented on its op-ed pages, the Times strove to inform America through high journalistic standards, accuracy, and fairness. The publication has won far more Pulitzer Prizes than any other media company in U.S. history, with its first being awarded more than 100 years ago. But over the last 20 years, Times reporters have ever more frequently veered spectacularly from their own journalistic guidelines. As a result, it has become commonplace to find New York Times stories containing egregious factual errors or infected with bias. In fact, this entire show exists because there's certain ways that media represents stories that are worth commenting on. Such lapses have contributed to public distrust of the Times and a landscape where partisan actors can cry fake news with some justification. New York Times used to be great, Your Honor, but not lately. But the New York Times still wields a powerful and influential megaphone in the media and greater society. It is therefore under a solemn obligation, note, not a legal obligation, to do the work necessary to get its reporting right. As reporters at the Times well know, getting it wrong can lead to disastrous outcomes for story subjects, including financial, professional, and reputational ruin. And New York Times sets the narrative and tone for other news organizations, amplifying the impact of its mistakes. The instant case is emblematic of the Times having lost its way, as the facts here make plain that the Times failed to follow its own journalistic standards, rushed to judgment, and with careless disregard, published a story accusing plaintiffs of waging a smear campaign against Lively, causing a feeding frenzy based on a demonstrably false premise. At 9:43 p.m. on December 20th, TUI requested plaintiffs' response to its reporting regarding a crisis communication operation conducted on behalf of Justin Baldoni. TUI wrote in part, "We are seeking your response to the claims of retaliation through this PR campaign, and we would welcome the opportunity to talk with you on the record. Please offer an on-the-record comment as well as any other information you think we should know. Additionally, please notify us of any inaccuracies. We need to hear back from you tomorrow by noon Eastern." Note that language because this is going to come up again in just a minute. At 2:16 a.m., plaintiffs' legal representatives responded as follows. I'm going to read most of this, but there's a lot of legalese here. "It is shameful that Ms. Lively and her representatives would make such serious and categorically false accusations against Mr. Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and its representatives, as yet another desperate attempt to fix her negative reputation which was garnered from her own remarks and actions during the campaign for the film. Interviews and press activities that were observed publicly in real time and unedited, which allowed for the internet to generate their own views and opinions. These claims are completely false, outrageous, and intentionally salacious with an intent to publicly hurt and rehash a narrative in the media. Wayfarer Studios made the decision to proactively hire a crisis manager prior to the marketing campaign of the film to work alongside their own representative with Jones Works, employed by Stephanie Jones, due to the multiple demands and threats made by Ms. Lively during production, which included her threatening to not show up on set, threatening to not promote the film, ultimately leading to its demise during release if her demands were not met. It was also discovered that Ms. Lively enlisted her own representative, Leslie Sloan with Vision PR, who also represents Mr. Reynolds, to plant negative and completely fabricated and false stories with media, even prior to any marketing had commenced for the film, which was another reason why Wayfarer Studios made the decision to hire a crisis professional to commence internal scenario planning in the case they needed to address. The representatives of Wayfarer Studios still did nothing proactive, nor retaliated, and only responded to incoming media inquiries to ensure balanced and factual reporting and monitored social activity. What is pointedly missing from the cherry-picked correspondence is the evidence that there were no proactive measures taken with media or otherwise, just internal scenario planning and private correspondence to strategize, which is standard operating procedure with public relations professionals. So it's a long statement, and it is a statement that is used in part in the New York Times article way up here, if I can find it. It's way too long. But that is essentially immediately discounted, right? These claims are completely false, outrageous, and intentionally salacious with an intent to publicly hurt and rehash a narrative in the media, the lawyer Brian Friedman wrote. Mr. Friedman did not address her allegations about misconduct during the filming. He alleged that Ms. Lively planted negative and completely fabricated and false stories with media, which he said was another reason why Wayfarer Studios made the decision to hire a crisis professional. Interestingly, they only put the planting in there. They don't talk about the other aspects of what is said in that statement. But this is immediately prior to that sentence that I talked about earlier in this video, which the New York Times reports as the effort to tarnish Ms. Lively appears to have paid off. Even when reading this the first time, it sounded like the New York Times was just giving full credence to the complaint side of things and didn't even give any credence to the statement made by the Baldoni side of things. And that doesn't appear right to me. That doesn't appear to be good reporting to me. I don't think that's illegal reporting, but I think it's worth noting in this context, and as was noted by Baldoni's attorney. At 10:11 a.m. on December 21st, the Times published the article. Notwithstanding that the Times was made aware of the egregiously defamatory allegations contained therein, it proceeded with publication without further inquiry. Indeed, in its rush to publish a one-sided, unsubstantiated story on behalf of Lively, the Times got it dramatically wrong. The aftershocks have been disastrous for plaintiffs, and they now reluctantly, and knowing the damage cannot be fully undone, bring suit to hold the Times accountable for its egregious misfire. So that's the facts. Now we'll actually get into some legal claims. I know, you thought they might not ever come. It's only 119 paragraphs of facts, people. Just a typical legal document. First cause of action, libel, the big one. Plaintiffs against all defendants. Plaintiffs incorporate by reference each and every allegation set forth in paragraphs 1 through 119, inclusive as if set forth fully herein. So they write those facts paragraphs in order to use them when the legal claims are made, and they do this. They just say it's inclusive of everything else. You've probably seen that if you've read through any other lawsuits, either here or on any other legal channels. As alleged herein, on December 21st, the Times published the article. The article purported to detail a campaign allegedly orchestrated by plaintiffs to tarnish Lively. Persons who read the article reasonably understood the references to Baldoni, Heath, Sarowitz, Abel, Nathan, and Wallace and their respective companies to be references to the plaintiffs. The article contains fabricated, false, malicious, and defamatory statements of fact concerning plaintiffs. The article is libelous on its face and exposes plaintiffs to hatred, contempt, ridicule, and obloquy. I actually don't know that word. Causes plaintiffs to be shunned or avoided and has a tendency to injure them in their occupation. Specifically, the article falsely attributes negative public sentiment towards Lively to a malicious, premeditated affirmative smear campaign orchestrated by plaintiffs and not to Lively's long-standing reputational challenges and whims of a fickle and sometimes cruel online public. Your Honor, this is just the interneting. The article advances its false narrative by cherry-picking out of context, and in some cases doctored, private communications never intended for public disclosure or consumption to advance a highly inflammatory, one-sided narrative plainly designed to villainize plaintiffs, manufacture an impression of impropriety where none exists, and grossly exaggerate plaintiffs' control over online public opinion or the tone and tenor of press coverage, particularly with respect to an enormously well-resourced A-list actress with their own pit bull press team. The article also falsely portrays plaintiffs as motivated to harm Lively. As the unlawfully obtained communications demonstrate, however, that is flatly false. Plaintiffs' motivations were defensive in nature and driven by the valid concern that Lively's team had been seeding stories critical of Baldoni and Wayfarer. I don't think they actually established that in the facts that we just saw. And the Times, without elaboration, dismisses this concern as baseless, treating plaintiffs' candid private discussions, which were never intended to see the light of day, as if it were a press release. In fact, as the Times should know from the voluminous confidential communications it apparently has obtained, plaintiffs' concerns were not baseless. And again, there's really no reason to believe the Times had access to everything that would have been in those signal and text messages. Plaintiffs are informed and believe, and based thereon allege, that defendants and each of them portrayed plaintiffs in this manner, knowing that the portrayal was false or with reckless disregard for its truth or falsity. Remember, that's the standard for a figure of public interest. This is apparent because, per the article, the Times reviewed, among other documents, thousands of pages of text messages and emails. Defendants therefore had access to documents and communications sufficient to refute its portrayal of plaintiffs. So that sentiment in the article is fully necessary for this particular lawsuit against the New York Times. They can't win this lawsuit if New York Times doesn't have any reason to believe that the complaint allegations are false. And so they have to bootstrap their case on this one notion early on that these and other documents were reviewed by the New York Times includes thousands of pages of text messages and emails, and not just the excerpts thereof that are included in the complaint document. I don't think they can actually square that circle. And I certainly don't think they can square that circle just in the complaint and the lawsuit itself, which puts them in the direct crosshairs of the California anti-SLAPP statute, which would get this case kicked out of court almost instantaneously. That said, that's the claim that they have to make, because if they can't say that the Times knew it was false, they can't win a defamation case. They can't win anything at all. Indeed, the totality of the communications obtained and reviewed by the Times were not spliced dishonestly, cherry-picked, and stripped of critical context, refute the article's premise that plaintiffs were responsible for negative public sentiment towards Lively, and the implication throughout that plaintiffs were motivated to harm Lively and engaged in unethical behavior to do so. Defendants knew that their portrayal of plaintiffs was false, incomplete, misleading, and highly inflammatory. And again, this is a legal document. They have to make this claim in order to make this case for libel. I'm more inclined individually to suggest that this is more incompetence or more a statement in that complaint that aligns with what the author and perhaps even the institution want to publish and put out there. We saw this with respect to Depp v. Heard. We saw this with respect to the articles that would come out even the days of the trial and how they described what happened in that trial. It's the reason Hangouts and Headlines exists, is because those headlines were not matching with what we were all seeing in real time in a publicly broadcast trial in that case. And this is not that same situation. We have to interpret things through the documents that we are seeing. But this does appear to be a similar case where Blake Lively and her team present a complaint that presents a useful jumping off point for the New York Times. The New York Times is not so desirous of disproving this complaint, and so they publish it really sight unseen. Is that defamation? Not really. Not for a person of public renown speaking on an issue of public interest, right? So they unfortunately have to show in that circumstance with Baldoni and Wayfarer that New York Times actually knew or was reckless about not knowing that it was false when they made that particular assertion in the article that they wrote. I don't see them getting there. The actual malice of defendants and each of them is evident from their deliberate decision to publish the article without having afforded plaintiffs a meaningful opportunity to respond, verified the authenticity, accuracy, and completeness of the communications relied upon, or ensure even a modicum of impartiality, skepticism, or even-handedness when covering highly inflammatory allegations they knew could destroy the reputation and careers of plaintiffs. So understand, this paragraph is trying to set a new legal standard. It's trying to say that we can show actual malice, which is the standard for defamation against a public figure, by them not giving us a meaningful opportunity to respond, not doing their homework, not ensuring a modicum of impartiality. This is not the standard. The New York Times is a full freedom of the press, freedom of speech, citizen of the United States for this purpose. The First Amendment basically abhors things that prohibit freedom of speech, freedom of the press. That's why defamation has such narrow rules to actually win a case on its grounds. And so their argument here that the New York Times has to ensure even a modicum of impartiality is completely wrong. And the New York Times doesn't have to be out there as an objective source of news. They could just decide to be a tabloid in rename themselves Team Lively, and that's just what they go out there with. Verify the authenticity is good, but they don't have an obligation to go and do extra homework on this score. One can easily make the case that a reasonable person would assume that the allegations in the complaint are true, that that's enough to base an article on, certainly on the existence of the complaint document itself. I would have written the New York Times article differently to get to that point, but they don't have to verify all of this to your standard, Mr. Plaintiff. They have to not know that it's false when they publish the article. Affording the plaintiffs a meaningful opportunity to respond, that's journalistic ethics. That's an ethics concept. That's not a legal concept. So again, they're trying to move the ball here. I understand why. This is an enormously difficult case to win. It's the reason Johnny Depp didn't sue the Washington Post. The Washington Post has every ability to rely on what Amber Heard is saying. He sued Amber Heard because Amber Heard can't disclaim her own knowledge of what happened and what didn't happen. But this is not right now a lawsuit against Blake Lively and her team. As a direct and proximate result of the above described actions by defendants, and each of them, plaintiffs have suffered general and special damages in the amount of not less than $250 million, including damage to plaintiffs' reputations and standing in the community, shame, mortification, hurt feelings, embarrassment, humiliation, damage to peace of mind, emotional distress, and injury in their occupations. Now, this is not a particularly strong paragraph for establishing damages. Again, I don't view this lawsuit as one that's really trying to get across the finish line and win millions of dollars from the New York Times. So you can understand why this is a little bit lightly sketched. But generally speaking, emotional distress on this score is not going to be enough. You're really going to have to point to losing your agency, point to losing opportunities to make motion pictures. You saw this again in Depp v. Heard, where Amber Heard had experts try to go out there and say that she lost X amount of dollars in business, and Johnny Depp lost X amount of dollars in business from the various attacks on each other. And that was a part of that case. We're not at that point in time. This is just a legal complaint at this moment. But social embarrassment, emotional humiliation, these are not an easy way to get to a $250 million number. Plaintiffs are informed and believe and based thereon allege that the conduct of defendants in each of them was malicious. Plaintiffs are informed and believed that defendants in each of them depicted plaintiffs in a defamatory manner in a conscious disregard of plaintiffs' legal rights. Plaintiffs are informed and believe and based thereon allege that defendants and each of them intended to injure plaintiffs by the defamatory statements in the article. But again, we go back to looking at jury instructions on defamation, and I'm not saying there will be a jury here, although a jury is requested. Even if it were a bench trial, you still have the same standards. I just find jury instructions to be the best way to explain the various things that people have to think about here. You have to show that the statements were false. You have to show that the Justin Baldoni has clear and convincing evidence that New York Times knew the statements were false or had serious doubts about the truth of the statements when they published their statements. You have to show actual damages, harm to property, business, trade, profession, etc. All of those aspects of this particular case are going to be difficult, and that's even if you got past the anti-SLAPP statute that California has. Then we get something that's even a little bit more interesting: false light invasion of privacy. Now, there are various different laws in various different states in the United States that have different concepts about things like this, but basically, this is publishing something that might be, strictly speaking, true, but has a tendency to cast a negative light on things because people read between the lines, and the publisher should know that, right? Plaintiffs incorporate by reference all the facts. As alleged herein, defendants published false statements of and concerning plaintiffs. To the extent the trier of fact finds that these statements are not defamatory, plaintiffs are informed and believe and based thereon alleged that defendants in each of them intended to depict plaintiffs in a false, fictionalized, and sensationalized light in order to catalyze public opprobrium towards plaintiffs, stir public discussion of the article, and draw readers to the Times. So they acted like a tabloid. And even if they weren't defamatory, we should get this lower level of defamation as a concept that exists in California. Now, this jury instruction is a little bit more interesting because it says, okay, what do you have to show for false light? Justin Baldoni claims that New York Times violated his right to privacy. To establish this claim, Justin Baldoni must prove all of the following: that New York Times publicly disclosed information or material that showed Justin Baldoni in a false light. So they went out there with the text messages. They went out there with the things that were in that complaint document. Again, with Blake Lively and her team very likely to be the origination point for that, this becomes a little bit more complicated. That the false light created by the disclosure would be highly offensive to a reasonable person in Justin Baldoni's position. There's clear and convincing evidence that New York Times knew the disclosure would create that false impression about Justin Baldoni. Again, so a notion of the falseness, or that the New York Times was negligent in determining the truth of the information. So this is where you get some of that extra stuff about the New York Times not doing its homework. That probably doesn't actually play into the defamation claim. You can't just make defamation out of that. You might make a false light kind of claim about it on the score that the California statute here apparently puts forth. But that might have its own First Amendment concerns. There's a whole bunch of stuff that could happen here if you survived anti-SLAPP, etc. That Justin Baldoni was harmed, or that Justin Baldoni sustained harm to his business, that Justin Baldoni's conduct was a substantial, that New York Times conduct was a substantial factor in Justin Baldoni's harm. Now, notably, part of the notes here, one of the reasons I like jury instructions is that there's a whole host of things that come into play from court cases and jury verdicts that have been decided in any given jurisdiction that might not be evident from just reading the statute or even the jury instructions. And you get sources and authority, you get little references to how these things have been interpreted in the various states. False light is a species of invasion of privacy based on publicity that places a plaintiff before the public in a false light that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. And this is California, right? California is the land of Hollywood celebrity. And so they have a lot of extra statutes, a lot of extra concepts that really talk about publication of people and hurting them in a way that is unjust. But a false light claim like libel exposes a person to hatred, contempt, ridicule, or obloquy, again, a word I don't recognize, and assumes the audience will recognize it as such. In order to be actionable, the false light in which a plaintiff is placed must be highly offensive to a reasonable person. I'm not sure that is the case for the smear campaign. It might be the case for the sexual harassment. But when a false light claim is coupled with a defamation claim, the false light claim is essentially superfluous and stands or falls on whether it meets the same requirements as the defamation cause of action, right? And these are precedents in California. It doesn't mean that every court will follow them entirely, but they are obligated to follow the spirit of them for the most part. And so it's worth noting that this is essentially a tack-on kind of provision in this lawsuit, because even in California, false light is essentially a part of a defamation claim. And so they try to argue in the alternative in their lawsuit. They say, hey, if you don't find defamation, find false light instead. But because false light is really a kind of defamation, just not as express as defamation itself, then you really don't have a different standard here for these two specific causes of action. Then we proceed to even more interesting interpretations of the events that took place in this particular set of facts. Third cause of action, promissory fraud. What I call in my videos, what you might have heard me call earlier, detrimental reliance. This is the notion that you can defraud someone by making them believe that you have made a promise and then not following through on it. On or about Friday, December 20th, 2024, at approximately 9:45 p.m., you have the message from TUI to Baldoni's people saying you have until noon to get back to us. Plaintiffs are informed to believe that the Times had been coordinating with Lively and her team to align the publication of the article with the filing of the complaint. Although plaintiffs strongly believe that the Times had not afforded them remotely enough time to meaningfully respond to the allegations, they fully intended to make use of that brief window to correct the record as best they could. However, the Times published the article without warning at 10:11 a.m., cutting off plaintiffs' ability to do so and catalyzing a feeding frenzy. Plaintiffs are informed and believe and based thereon allege the defendants and each of them reached out to plaintiffs to pay lip service to journalistic ethics and fundamental fairness and never intended or wanted for plaintiffs to respond. Plaintiffs are informed and believe and based thereon allege that defendants and each of them intended for plaintiffs to rely on their false promise, which plaintiffs did, in fact, do to their detriment as a direct and approximate result of the above described conduct of defendants, and each of them plaintiffs have been harmed in an amount to be proven at trial. This is a very difficult cause of action to win, right? So the nature of detrimental reliance, and maybe I have two of these by mistake, false promise, is that Justin Baldoni claims he was harmed because the New York Times made a false promise. To establish this claim, Justin Baldoni must prove that New York Times made a promise to him, that New York Times did not intend to perform its promise when they made it, that the New York Times intended that Justin Baldoni rely on that promise, that Justin Baldoni reasonably did rely on that promise, that New York Times did not perform the promised act, that Justin Baldoni was harmed. So there's a whole bunch of things that are not happening in this fact pattern. But interestingly, the notion that you said that this was just done for lip service is trying to establish that you didn't mean to give him till noon anyway. But I don't know that that's clear. And it's unclear exactly what you were trying to do to harm Baldoni and his team by saying that you had until noon, unless you thought that they would be working on an answer and not get it in. But there's no indication that they had an answer that was ready, a document, an email, something else they would send to the New York Times, and that they didn't get it in response, that the earliness hurt them. So these get really weak. The last one is even weaker. Breach of implied in fact contract. So the notion here is that by sending an email that says, we hope that you respond to us by noon tomorrow, is a contract, right? And in a contract, you have to make promises that go across two parties. You have to have what we call consideration. And here they're going to argue that through their express written words, the New York Times offered until noon the next morning to respond to the allegations. We accepted their offer, which created an implied in fact contract, whereby the Times would refrain from publication for a brief period in exchange for a substantive response to the allegations. That's the consideration. They're saying the Times wants a response to the allegations so they can have a complete article, so they're going to avoid publishing for a short period of time, and that's the consideration of this contract, and we were harmed because they breached it by publishing early. I don't see a contract here, honestly. I can see the legal kind of hand-waving that you're doing trying to make it a contract, but we're publishing this article. Please give us comment by tomorrow at noon is not, to me, an express promise that we're not going to publish by noon. And making out that they're giving you consideration in order to get commentary to improve their article is, I think, a little bit of a reach for legal purposes. So again, this case is not about those things. It's not about a fraud on the promise. It's not about an implied contract term. They want to add those things because it makes the New York Times look bad. And they want you to be thinking about the fact that the New York Times is a bad actor when you think about their libel claim. It's a libel case. But I wanted to talk you through all of them because I think it's important. And they also ask for a jury trial, which is normal. You want a jury trial if you've got on the other side people that you think are going to be seen by the jury as giant institutional actors from New York City with a New York City penthouse, or bad Hollywood actresses, or however else you want to think about this, because there's a notion that juries can be susceptible to essentially prejudgment based on their notions of what the New York Times company does out in Los Angeles. And that's the lawsuit. So at the end of the day, from a legal perspective, I want to say I don't see this going anywhere. I think it was chosen to be in California because it's not likely to go anywhere. They wanted to get their message out, and this was the easiest way to do a press release that would be picked up by a lot of places. You can feel one way or the other about that. I think that the story they tell is more compelling and more convincing than the story Blake Lively and her team tell, but there is an advantage to going first. And I think Lively and her team might have realized that through the New York Times article. I don't think the New York Times is going down for defamation. I think Blake Lively and her team could conceivably have a defamation kind of issue later on with another lawsuit, but I don't know how much appetite Wayfarer or Baldoni have to pursue this further. They do promise in their introduction that there are more lawsuits to come, but none so far as of yet that I know of. You can correct me in the chat if you see something. But for the most part, from a legal perspective, I think this is a non-starter as a legal matter, but it's very interesting from a look behind the curtain, see how these PR corporations operate, see how PR works in the celebrity sphere, and understand a little bit better how the headlines in Hangouts and Headlines come to be. And of course, that's not the end of our story altogether, because as I mentioned a couple of times in this video, Blake Lively sues. It ends with us co-star and director Justin Baldoni for sexual harassment, right? So the complaint document was about sexual harassment and about retaliation for that. That gets built out in the New York Times article as showing a Hollywood smear campaign. Baldoni sues for defamation on those grounds, and as part of the defamation lawsuit says, hey, if they actually wanted to fight this issue, they would have sued us. They wouldn't have leaked a complaint to the New York Times. And Blake Lively says, all right, we'll sue you. And they are suing in federal court. So they are using that diversity of jurisdiction, the fact that people live in different states in the United States, to pursue a federal remedy, which is at least marginally more likely to become real at the end of the day. But it's going to depend on proof and that sexual harassment actually happened. And certainly the story that the Baldoni team tells in that libel lawsuit that we just read is suggestive of at least certain amounts of hyperbole and maybe eliding the truth in certain circumstances. And one would hope that if that is in fact the case, that would come out as part of that legal process. But again, even in that case that we are likely to look over in another video in this series, but I don't know whether I want to cover the Stephanie Jones lawsuit and this sexual harassment lawsuit as part of it, except for completeness, that it's unlikely to come out because nobody really wants to go too deep into discovery on these kinds of issues when you've got so much reputational risk on both sides of this equation. So I would see that settling again, but most civil cases settle in any event. So that's not really a huge judgment call on my behalf. It's just what I see likely to happen. But I think you can stay tuned potentially for another video in this series on this. I also wanted to mention that there are folks out there connecting dots on their own with all this, the libel suit and whatnot. There was a fairly popular Twitter exchange that noted that the character of Nice Pool in Deadpool versus Wolverine, or Deadpool and Wolverine, portrayed by Ryan Reynolds, seems to be a play up of Justin Baldoni. Says, "Oh my goodness, wait till you've seen Lady Pool. She's gorgeous. She just had a baby too, and I can't even tell. I don't think you're supposed to say that." To which Nice Pool calmly responds, "That's okay. I identify as a feminist." This parallels Justin Baldoni's public persona as an activist and feminist, and that's not too much on its own, but there's a lot in this thread. This scene features a supervillain, Cassandra Nova, using her powers to probe Deadpool's mind, also played by Ryan Reynolds. As she invades his memories, Deadpool exclaims, "And where in God's name is the intimacy coordinator?" A pointed jab referencing Blake's allegations. Again, Deadpool is a role in which is breaking the fourth wall, and intimacy coordinator is a, unfortunately, well-known kind of title for somebody that works on creating a movie, which of course Deadpool and Wolverine is. So I'm not sure that that's a direct reference either. But again, more evidence. Additionally, here in the outtakes, the scene with Nice Pool seems to be another dig at Justin. Nice Pool smugly remarks, "My calling is to host a podcast that monetizes the women's movement," which appears to be a parody of Baldoni's feminist podcast, Man Enough. Here, Nice Pool imitates Justin being criticized for opening up about his trauma and turning to faith and spirituality for healing, which Justin has openly discussed in his podcast and interviews. And then what happens to Nice Pool's character at the end? Well, he gets shot to death multiple times by Lady Pool, played by Blake Lively herself, while Deadpool, played by Ryan Reynolds, uses Nice Pool as a human shield. The scene takes place outside a flower shop. Referencing the movie, It Ends With Us. And again, I don't know that there's any validity to this. I do know that, in my opinion, Ryan Reynolds appears to be the kind of guy that would put this type of stuff in his movie. However you feel about that is up to you. And I can't verify that one way or the other, but it's clear that there are folks on social media going out there with these kinds of things. You can view that as planted by Baldoni's team, but it doesn't feel like that to me. And this is all out there throughout, including articles like the ones we saw on Depp v. Heard, taking up some of these case points that we've discussed in this video series. People really want to hate on women, says the New Feminist. What the backlash against Blake Lively for her Justin Baldoni complaint warns of modern misogyny. And again, this is part of the playbook for this, right? And I think it's very, very, very unfortunate. If Baldoni is at all accurate in his portrayal of what actually happened on the set of this movie, it does ring to me of similarities with Depp v. Heard and the unfortunate ability of people to take advantage of the zeitgeist and wanting to protect women in a way that is very disadvantageous to the women that actually need that protection. And these articles are out there. I'm not going to go over this right now, but it does grab onto that one quote from, I think it's Nathan, that says people just might want to hate on women right now. And I think that's a part of this story as well. But that's all for another time. We've talked now for 3+ hours. And before we go, I do want to mention to folks, again, that this is a channel supported by folks like you, whether listening to it live right now or later on in replay, through places like Player or Patreon, gifting memberships, doing super chats, upvoting, downvoting. I appreciate it all. Thank you so much for being here. 3.5 hours later than our start. If you have any comments or questions about what I've covered, any disagreements or anything, definitely leave comments to this video. I'm happy to engage as much as possible with those. But if you're live right now in chat, let me know, and I will try to grab them as much as I can. I will also try to grab any super chats if I remember to do so before I leave you. And I think I've grabbed them all. So thank you so much. B says, thank you for covering the lawsuit. I'm doing my best, trying to hang in there. Did not mean to go 3.5 hours on this one. I will take a long nap after this probably, but I appreciate all of you helping support the channel and interest in these topics and others. Megan492 says, I find it so insulting when if you ask questions about someone's motives and want facts, you hate women. She has resources and the New York Times to get her story out. If we don't believe it, there's a reason. I think there are bad actors out there that'll just disbelieve anything that a woman claims, anything that a man claims. I think there are bad actors all around. I think humanity has bad actors in it, in every strata, every racial group, every sex, every gender, every religion, every institution. And that's an unfortunate fact of playing out here in the real world. But I do think it is fair to think critically about all these things. And I think we can think critically about Lively's complaint. I think we can think critically about Baldoni's essentially riposte here with the lawsuit against the New York Times. I think that's a valuable thing that we can do. I hope we can continue to keep doing it here in Hangouts and Headlines and on Virtual Legality. Catherine Frazier says, Baldoni's passivity reminds me of Depp's passivity. They are at a disadvantage. I think there is a strong desire from some people to want to make the conflict go away, right? To say, okay, this is going to be easier to handle if I appease this vector of complaint or discomfort. And I think some bad actors can take advantage of that. If the Baldoni lawsuit is accurate in what happened behind the scenes and it ends with us, then it seems like Lively Reynolds were taking advantage of that impulse. And I think that's a shame for living in a society. Against the Tide reminds, make sure to check out the Big Cast on Sunday. Yes, I should do all the YouTube-y things, as Emily D. Baker says. Hit all those buttons. Check out my various videos. I've been doing more here on the channel. I did one on video gaming and Ubisoft, if you're interested in that, last week. I'll probably do another one on Tencent and Chinese involvement in military affairs and whatnot to come. I'm trying to make those shorter, a little bit more focused, a little bit less of an investment that you need to give to the channel in order to participate in these conversations, but I'm also doing them as tapes, so not the same kind of live interaction that we can have here. And thank you, everybody who's giving me thank yous in the chat. I love having these conversations as much as I can do them, so thank you for being here. HP, one of my favorite coverages so far, as you come across as very neutral and fair to both sides. Like I said, I do lean Baldoni on reading these two documents back to back, but I think there are holes in either side of the equation. Katerina Godecki says, thank you for your in-depth coverage and for bringing together people you can actually discuss a point with in the comments. I am so proud of this community. I really feel like Reasonable Minds Can Differ has taken up the watchword phraseology of the community. People really do believe that here, and we try to keep it that way. You can disagree on points. You can disagree on points that are really important, to you, and still not dehumanize and think of the other person as less than because they've come to a different conclusion than you. And I thank everybody who participates in this community for continuing to evidence that here and out there on social media and the internet. I am very proud of all of you for that. Happy Sunrise says, hope your voice is okay. It'll recover. It's pretty fine. I wasn't anticipating talking for 3.5 hours, but I knew that I had set up a lot of stuff to chat about. Kerry Harvey does say if he had been more aggressive, he would have been accused of abusing his power. Well, that is a bit of a catch-22, but I think there is a way to say, no, we can't do this. We have to do it this way. I'm the director. I'm the producer, whatever it is, whatever capacity it is, not just with Baldoni and Lively, and do what needs to be done to get a project across the finish line. And I think that people have been successful in making movies and getting projects done while still working with quote unquote difficult contributors, and just noting that for the future in the making of whatever it is that they're making. So I would anticipate that Blake Lively is going to have at least a little bit of a question mark around her difficulty in pursuing future movie careers based on what we saw in the lawsuit we just went over today. But I would hope that both Baldoni and Lively aren't just blacklisted based on allegations, right? Even though I think the story told in the lawsuit today is compelling, I wouldn't have anybody just cast aside or tossed to the curb based on what a lawyer puts together in a series of compelling paragraphs in a legal document. Because not to toot our own horns, but oftentimes we can be pretty good at persuasion and persuasive writing. And it's important to get to what actually happened if you're going to have real negative deleterious effects on somebody's livelihood and career. Renata says, I think they're trying to compare the woman to Amber and the man to Depp. Baldoni has nothing to do with Depp. That's true. Baldoni has nothing to do with Depp. But I do think there are similarities with what Baldoni's team has accused Lively's team of doing with respect to It Ends With Us, insofar as kind of that gaslighting, negative appease me or die approach to intergender communications. All right. Carrie says, thank you, Hoeg. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm going to wish you a fantastic Tuesday. And like I said, I'm probably going to sleep this off for a little while. But I appreciate you all for being here. I appreciate you all for supporting the channel. and for telling folks about these kinds of videos. I really feel like they're important. I feel like we're doing a good job here talking about these things in a reasoned way, having good chats, having good commentary live. And I will see you on the next episode, either of Hangouts or Headlines or Virtual Legality, or if I don't get another one done this week, on Bigcast on Sunday. So thank you so much, and I will catch you then.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.